The well was dry. Everyone in the county knew it. Nobody wanted the land. Nobody wanted the cabin. Nobody wanted any of it. So when she put her last $1.50 on that desk and said she'd take it, the old clerk just stared at her. She didn't explain herself. She walked 14 miles to get there. Alone, no horse, no plan. Just a hammer in her bag that had belonged to a dead man, and $9 that weren't really hers, and a name on a deed that nobody else wanted. 3 months later, fire came in the night. Then lawyers came from Cheyenne. Then the most powerful man in the territory showed up at her door, with a number that was supposed to make her disappear quietly. She didn't disappear. What she found at the bottom of that well changed everything. Not just for her. For everyone who had ever tried to take what wasn't theirs. This is that story. The morning Elsa Hale left Redstone, nobody came to say goodbye. Not one person. She stood outside the back door of the mercantile at 6:30, her canvas bag over one shoulder and a worn leather satchel in her other hand. The street was empty. The sky was the color of old pewter, pale and flat, the kind of sky that doesn't promise anything. A rooster somewhere behind the livery stable made its noise. A dog barked twice, then quit. The town breathed its slow morning breath and paid her no mind whatsoever. She had expected that. She told herself she had expected that. The envelope was in her coat pocket. She could feel it every time she moved, a stiff little rectangle pressing against her ribs like a finger poking. $9. That was the sum of 6 years. $9 and a handwritten list of expenses that Rupert Voss had prepared with the meticulous care of a man who genuinely believed his own arithmetic. Board and keep, it read. 6 years. Adjusted for market rate. She had read it 3 times the night before, sitting on the edge of the narrow cot in the storeroom that had been her bedroom for the better part of her adult life. The storeroom smelled of dried beans and axle grease and the faint sweetness of tobacco that had soaked into the walls over decades. Her parents had built this store. Her father had laid the floorboards himself. Her mother had painted the sign above the door in careful block letters HALE, though the H had faded so badly over the years that most people in town just called it the Ale House as a joke, which her mother had never found funny and her father had always pretended not to hear. Elsa had folded the list back into the envelope and put it in her pocket. She hadn't cried. She had made a decision not to cry, and she was a person who, once she made a decision, tended to keep it. The satchel contained 1 change of clothes, a wool blanket, a small tin of matches, a half-eaten piece of hard cornbread wrapped in cloth, a canteen she'd filled at the pump before dawn, and a copy of a surveying almanac she'd found behind the counter 3 years ago and never gotten around to returning to whoever had left it. The canvas bag contained the one thing she hadn't let out of her sight since Edmund Holt had pressed it into her hands 4 months ago, 2 days before he died. The hammer. It wasn't much to look at. The head was iron, small and dense, the kind of hammer a man uses for fine work, not for splitting logs or driving fence posts. The handle was white oak, pale and smooth from years of use, worn to exactly the shape of Edmund's grip, so that it sat slightly wrong in Elsa's hand. She had not tried to adjust to it. She liked that it felt like his. Edmund Holt had been the best man she knew. She had not told him that while he was alive, which was the kind of thing you couldn't take back and couldn't fix, and she had decided not to waste energy on it. He was gone. The hammer was here. That was the shape of things. She had worked for Edmund since she was old enough to carry wood without dropping it, sweeping his shop floor, learning the names of his tools before she understood what half of them were for. He had a way of teaching that wasn't teaching at all. It was more like thinking out loud in the presence of someone who was paying attention. He would run his thumb along the grain of a piece of pine and say something like, "See how it wants to go this way, not that way." And somehow that was the whole lesson. See how it wants to go. He taught her to read wood the way other people read faces. He taught her that a nail-driven wrong would hold for a while but always betray you in the end. He taught her that the best joint doesn't need glue, because if you cut it right, the wood holds itself. He had a saying he used so often it had stopped sounding like a saying and started sounding like a fact of nature. Grit without skill is just damage. She had heard it so many times she sometimes said it to herself without realizing, a quiet background hum in her mind when she was working through something difficult. He had not left her money. He had not left her the shop, which had passed to the county for back taxes within a week of his death. He had left her the hammer pressed into her hand with both of his, and the look on his face was not sad. It was something more like satisfied, the look of a man who had given what he actually had to give. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder and started walking. Redstone was not a large town. It took her less than 4 minutes to walk from the back door of the mercantile to the edge of the main street, and less than 2 more to clear the last building, which was the farrier's, and step out onto the wagon road that ran north. The road was pale and dry, beaten flat by years of wheels and hooves, and it stretched ahead of her in a long, gentle curve around the base of the first hill before disappearing from sight. She did not look back. This was a rule she had made for herself at some point in the last few years. Not a dramatic rule, not a rule she'd announced to anyone, just private discipline she found useful. When you're done with a place, you're done. Looking back is just confusion you manufacture for yourself. She walked. The morning warmed slowly, the way Wyoming mornings do in late September, grudgingly, as if the sun is doing you a favor. The sage on either side of the road was dusty and pale. It smelled sharp and clean in the cool air. A hawk hung in the sky to the east, not flapping, just hanging there on whatever column of air was holding it up, watching something below with an attention that made everything else seem casual by comparison. Elsa had heard about the land office from a woman named Bertie Crane, who ran the laundry on the south end of Redstone, and knew everything about everyone's business, without appearing to seek any of it out. Bertie had told her, almost as an aside, while handing back a folded shirt 3 weeks ago, that the county land office in Calderfield kept records on unclaimed parcels, and that there were always parcels, always, because people died and people left and people gave up, and the land didn't go anywhere just because its owner did. Elsa had filed that away and said nothing about it to Rupert, who had not asked about her plans, and had given every impression of not being interested in them. Calderfield was 14 miles north of Redstone. She figured she could make it by mid-afternoon if the road stayed dry and her feet stayed cooperative. Both were reasonable bets. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard a wagon behind her, the creak and clatter of it carrying in the still air before she could see it. She stepped to the side of the road without turning around. The wagon slowed as it came alongside her. The driver was a man, somewhere in his 60s, heavy-set, with a gray beard and the deeply lined face of someone who had spent most of his life squinting into wind. He looked her over with the frank, unhurried appraisal of a man who sees people walking this road often enough that they don't particularly surprise him. Heading north. The question landed like a statement. Calderfield, Elsa said. He jerked his chin toward the wagon bed, which held 3 large crates of something that smelled like machine oil and burlap. She climbed up without further conversation. He didn't ask her name and she didn't offer it. They rode in a silence that was, if not comfortable, at least honest. He dropped her at the junction half a mile south of Calderfield and drove east without a word. She watched the wagon until it was small, then walked the last stretch into town. Calderfield was larger than Redstone, not by much, but enough to have a proper bank and a hotel with 2 stories and a land office that had its own building, rather than sharing a wall with something else. The sign was new, the paint barely weathered, Wyoming Territory Land and Title. The door was unlocked and she pushed it open. The man behind the desk was old. Not the polite kind of old that people describe when they're trying to be kind, but genuinely, specifically old. The kind of old that accumulates slowly over many decades of sitting behind desks and saying careful things in careful ways. He had white hair combed flat against his skull and spectacles, so thick the lenses seemed to be doing significant work just to let him see through them. The nameplate on his desk read Silas Oaks. He looked up when she came in. His expression was not unfriendly, but it was not warm either. It was the expression of a man who has learned to hold judgment in reserve, because judgment takes energy and he has a finite supply. Help you? His voice was dry like paper. Elsa set her bag on the floor and stood in front of his desk. She did not sit because he had not offered her a chair, and she had found over the years that standing changed the nature of a conversation. "I'm looking for unclaimed land," she said. "County-held parcels. Anything in this area that's been on the books long enough that the county would consider releasing the deed." Oak studied her for a moment. Not with suspicion, exactly. More like assessment. The way Edmund used to look at a piece of wood before deciding what it was good for. He reached under his desk and produced a large leather ledger, bound with a cord that he untied with practiced slowness. He opened it somewhere near the middle and ran his finger down a column of entries. He turned a page, then another. His finger stopped. "There's one." He said it the way people say things they've been carrying for a while and aren't sure yet whether to put down. Dry Fork Creek, 14 miles northeast of here, 60 acres. Name on the original deed was Josiah Marsh. Went into arrears on taxes in 71. County took the parcel in 73 after 2 years of non-payment. No subsequent claims, no interest. He paused. 18 years it's been sitting. Why hasn't anyone taken it? Oakes took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his vest with the slowness of a man considering what to say. Land's poor for grazing, too rocky for crops, or so people assume. The cabin's near ruin. The well's been considered dry since Marsh left. He put his spectacles back on. It's the kind of place people point at from a distance and feel better about their own situation. Elsa thought about this. What happened to Marsh? Something moved behind Oakes's eyes. Not a large movement. The kind of movement that happens in someone's face when a question touches something they weren't expecting to be touched. Disappeared, he said. Just gone one day. Some said he went into the mountains. Some said he went east. Nobody knew. Or nobody said. The distinction landed quietly. Elsa noticed it. What's the filing fee? $1.50. He looked at her steadily. For whoever's willing to assume the tax burden going forward. Which is modest. The county just wants it off the books. She opened the envelope in her pocket and counted out $2. She set them on the desk. I'll take it. Oakes looked at the $2. He looked at her. He slid $1.50 worth of coin back across the desk. Exact change is customary, he said. But he held her gaze just a moment longer than the transaction required, and she had the distinct impression, though he gave no outward sign of it, that Silas Oakes had been waiting, for some stretch of years, for someone to come in and ask about that particular piece of land, and that he felt something complicated now that someone finally had. He stamped the deed. He signed his name in a slow, precise hand. He slid the paper across the desk. She picked it up, folded it once, and put it in her pocket alongside the envelope that held her $9. She walked out of the office with 60 acres of Wyoming and 7.5 to her name. The road to Dry Fork Creek was not a road. It was the memory of a road. Or perhaps the suggestion of 1-2 faint parallel lines in the dirt that might have been wagon tracks from the early 70s and had not been refreshed since. The grass had grown back in the middle strip. The sage had crept in from the sides. She followed it northeast by the position of the sun and the description Oakes had given her, which had been brief. Follow the creek road until you smell water, then look north. She smelled the creek before she saw it, the faint iron and mud smell of moving water in dry country, and she turned north as instructed. The land climbed gradually, becoming rockier, the soil shifting from the pale dust of the valley floor to something darker and coarser underfoot. Juniper trees appeared, then grew more frequent, their shapes twisted and compact, the way trees grow when they've had to work for every inch. She walked for 3 hours after leaving Calderfield. Her feet ached in a way that had stopped being interesting and become just a fact. The sun was in the west and throwing long shadows east when she crested a low ridge and saw the basin below. The cabin sat in the center of it. Sat was perhaps generous, it occupied the center for him. It had been sitting there for a long time and the effort had cost it something. The roof had given way on the south side, sagging toward the ground at an angle that suggested it had been fighting gravity for years and was losing. The door was gone entirely, the opening a black rectangle in the weathered gray of the log wall. The window on the east side was an empty hole. What had once been a corral to the west of the cabin was now a loose arrangement of leaning posts connected by nothing, its rails long since fallen or taken. The basin itself was surrounded by low rocky hills with juniper and sage on the slopes. It was quiet in the particular way that places are quiet when they've been empty for a very long time. Not peaceful. Quiet. The two things are different. Elsa stood on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the well. It was 15 feet from the cabin door, and it was the only thing in the entire basin that looked like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it with intention. A perfect circle of fitted stone, rising 2 feet from the ground, each stone chosen for how it would sit against the next, locked together without mortar by nothing but precision and patience. The capstone on the south side had been placed at a slight angle that she recognized, without being able to immediately articulate why, as deliberate. The well was old, but it was right. Edmund would have approved of that well. She came down off the ridge and walked to the cabin first. She set her bags inside the door opening and stood in the middle of the single room, letting her eyes adjust. The floor was dirt. The stove in the corner was a rusted wreck, its pipe long since separated and fallen. The south wall where the roof had given way had a gap at the top, and through it she could see a strip of sky going orange with the coming sunset. Leaves had blown in and decomposed into a layer on the floor. A bird had built a nest in the northeast corner, high up near the ceiling beam, and the beam itself was thick and straight and solid. She pressed her palm against it, and it did not move. The logs were gray and dry, silvered by 18 years of Wyoming weather. She pulled the adze from her satchel, the small one she'd bought at the hardware in Redstone 3 weeks ago when she'd started turning Bertie Crane's offhand comment into a plan, and she tested the logs at the corner. The wood was sound. Not beautiful, not anymore, but sound. There was a difference between weathered and rotted, and she had learned from Edmund how to tell them apart. The foundation was stone, laid flat and even, and it did not give under her weight anywhere she tested it. She went back outside. The sun was nearly at the horizon. She had about 20 minutes of usable light, and she wanted to use them on the well. The old bucket was in the lean-to at the east side of the cabin, which she had not noticed from the ridge because it was so collapsed as to barely constitute a structure at all. The bucket was warped and cracked, but when she held it up and looked through the staves, she saw no gaps large enough to matter for her immediate purpose. There was a length of rope coiled in the corner of the lean-to as well, frayed at one end and stiff with age, but she tested it against a post and it held her weight. She tied the rope to the bucket handle with a knot. Edmund had taught her and walked to the well. She leaned over the stone lip and looked down. The darkness inside was complete. She could smell it, though, and what she smelled was not dry stone and old leaves. There was something else below, something faint and damp and mineral. She filed that away. She lowered the bucket into the dark. It went down 6 feet before it hit something. Not water. The impact was solid, a dull thud that came back up through the rope. She lowered it another few inches and moved it sideways. The same. She tried again in a slightly different direction, her hands already working before her mind fully caught up with what this likely meant. The bottom of this well was not a bottom. It was blockage. She worked the bucket back and forth, dragging it sideways along whatever surface it was resting on, and on the third pass she felt something shift. Not much. The resistance changed slightly, became uneven, as if she'd found an edge. She pulled the rope up carefully, bringing the bucket with it, and when it cleared the lip of the well she looked inside. Dirt, small stones, and mixed in with them a piece of soft, dark wood. Old wood, not stone, which meant the obstruction below had once been structural. A cover, maybe, or the rim of an interior lining, something built to cap or protect the well that had eventually given way and fallen inward. The sky was dark purple behind the western hills when she went back into the cabin and made a fire in the broken stove with the matches from her tin and a handful of dry sage from outside. The stove smoked badly and threw more heat than she expected. She ate half the cornbread, drank carefully from her canteen, and lay down on the hard dirt floor with her blanket wrapped around her. She was not afraid. This surprised her less than it might have, because she had long since learned that fear and discomfort were different things, and that most of what people called fear was actually just discomfort they hadn't decided to accept yet. The beam above her was solid and true. She slept. She was up before dawn, not because she had told herself to be, but because her body had apparently made a decision about the schedule without consulting her. She rebuilt the fire, finished the cornbread, and was standing at the well with the bucket in her hands when the sky was still more gray than blue. The work was not complicated. It was just work. She lowered the bucket and dragged it across the blockage until it caught on something, then worked it back and forth until something shifted. She hauled up load after load of debris, dirt and leaves and waterlogged splinters of old wood, dumping each bucket on the ground to the south of the well where she could examine it. The first hour yielded almost nothing interesting. The second hour was more of the same, but the hole in the blockage was growing. She could feel it in the way the bucket moved, the resistance becoming less even, the rope slack at different points than before. On the 15th or 16th hole, she wasn't counting anymore. She brought up a piece of wood that was different from the rest. Thick, intentionally shaped, with a rusted iron bracket attached to one side. Not a stray piece of timber. This had been built. This had been placed. She went back to work. It took 3 days. 3 days of hauling and resting and hauling again, her arms going from aching to burning to a kind of dull, steady heat that was almost not painful anymore. She made trips to the creek half a mile south to refill her canteen, eating the last of her provisions by midday of the second day, and going without after that, which made her focus better than she expected. At some point during the second evening, she began to think about Rupert Voss without the usual accompanying tension, and she realized it was because she was too tired to be angry and had nothing left over for it. The anger would come back. She knew it would. But for now, there was just the rope and the bucket and the shifting debris below, and the faint, persistent smell rising up from deeper down, mineral and cool and alive. On the afternoon of the third day, the bucket came up differently. She felt it before she could articulate what had changed. The rope had a different quality in her hands, not heavier, but less hollow somehow, as if the space below had changed its nature. She hauled it up hand over hand, and when the bucket cleared the lip of the well, she held it still for a moment. The bottom of the bucket was wet, not damp, wet. A thin film of water covered the floor of the bucket, and the debris in it was mud, not dry grit. She lowered the bucket again quickly and let it drop the full length of rope. She felt the slight jolt when it hit the surface and then the give as it tipped and sank below. She pulled it up. The bucket was half full of cold, dark water. Elsa stood at the lip of the well with both hands on the rope, the bucket hanging in the air between them, and for a moment she did nothing at all. The water dripped from the bottom of the bucket. The afternoon sun was on the back of her neck. A hawk crossed the sky above the east hill in a long, unhurried arc. She drank from the bucket with both hands. The water was cold and tasted of stone and nothing else. Clean. She had been expecting it to taste of the past, of all those years of blockage and dark, but it tasted of nothing but itself. She stood straight and looked out across the basin. The cabin behind her, the fallen corral to the west, the ridge to the north catching the late light on its juniper slopes. The land was rocky and dry, and had been left for dead for 18 years by every person who had ever looked at it, including the county, including Rupert Voss, though she had not yet fully worked out what Rupert had to do with this place. Only that the particular way Silas Oakes had said the name Josiah Marsh, not with sadness but with something more layered than sadness, had not left her mind. She lowered the bucket one more time. On this pull, when the bucket was 6 feet down, it caught, not on rock, not on wood, on something that did not give when she tugged. She tugged harder. The rope went taut and held. She tried pulling it at a slightly different angle and felt the catch shift but not release. She worked it carefully, the way Edmund had taught her to work a stuck joint, not with force but with patience, small adjustments, reading the resistance. Something scraped against the stone wall of the well. Something moved, not the bucket. Whatever the bucket had snagged on had moved. She heard it. A low scraping sound rising up from below, stone on something harder than stone, or something harder than stone on the wall itself. She kept the tension on the rope, not pulling, just holding, and the sound continued for several seconds and then stopped. She gave the rope a slow, firm pull and felt the weight change, heavier now, and pulled again. The bucket came up. It came up with something attached to it. Caught on the rope just below the handle, tangled in a loop she had not put there, was what looked like a strap, leathered dark with age and water but intact, and attached to the strap was a box, square, flat-lidded, made of tin, wrapped in what had once been leather but was now something between leather and stone, a material that had spent so long in darkness and cold water that it had fused into a substance that was neither. She could see where the leather had been tied closed with cord, and the cord was black and stiff but still present. She set the bucket on the stone lip and her hands were very still. The box was not large. It was the size of a book, maybe, or a man's hat. Heavy for its size. The strap that had caught on her rope was attached to the side with rivets that had gone green with age. She wrapped both hands around it and lifted it free of the bucket and felt the weight of it settle into her palms. Whatever was inside had not moved in a long time. She carried it to the cabin threshold and sat down in the doorway with the last of the evening light on her back. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with something that was not quite pride, because she had not chosen to be steady, it was just how she was. She pulled at the cord. It resisted. She worked at the knot for several minutes until it gave, the cord so old and stiff that she felt it crack rather than loosen. The leather wrapping, when she pulled it back, was in better condition than it appeared from the outside. Dry on the inner surface. stiff but not destroyed. The tin box beneath it was intact. She pried the lid. It resisted, then gave with a sound that was not dramatic, just a flat pop of old air releasing. Inside, nested in what had once been a piece of wool cloth and was now a compressed gray felt, were three things. The first was a pouch, leather, tied shut with a drawstring. She could feel by squeezing it what was inside before she opened it. Coins. And when she did open it, she saw gold and silver both, a mix of denominations. And she counted it out on the stone threshold in the fading light. $340. She sat with that number for a moment. The second was a compass. Brass. Small enough to fit in a closed fist. The case was tarnished, but when she opened it, the needle swung and settled, sure and unhesitating, pointing north. On the inside of the lid, scratched into the brass with something small and sharp, were 4 words. For the one who stays. She held it in her palm for longer than she realized. The third thing was a letter, folded twice, wrapped in a separate piece of waxed cloth that had done its job. The paper was yellow, and the ink had faded at the edges, but the center was legible. She held it up to the last of the light and read it. The handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who had not written often and so wrote deliberately when they did. The letter began without preamble. My name is Josiah Marsh. I built this cabin in the spring of 1869. I proved up the claim with my wife Annabelle, and we lived here 4 years. The well was the first thing I built, and it is the best thing I built. You cannot live on dry ground. I found what I found in the 3rd year. Water. Real water, not a trickle, but a vein of it running deep and long beneath this basin, and stretching east across next to the ridge into the valley beyond. Enough water to change what this land is. I made drawings. They are with this letter. She looked in the tin box again. Beneath the wool she had not looked closely at, she found a folded paper, separate from the letter. She set it aside and kept reading. I had no money to develop what I found. I had the drawings and the knowledge and the land and nothing else. I told one man about it, which was my mistake. That man's name was Edmund Voss. Elsa stopped. She read the name again. Edmund Voss. Not Edmund Holt. Edmund Voss, which was the name of Rupert Voss's father, the man who had died in 1889 years ago, and whom Elsa had known only by reputation. A large man with a large presence who had come to Wyoming territory, before the territory was Wyoming, and had built his land holdings with the efficiency of someone who understood that the law was a tool, and that tools were for using. She kept reading, though her chest had gone tight. Edmund Voss came to me in the fall of 1871. He had heard something, I don't know from whom. He said he wanted to invest in developing the water. He had papers drawn up. I signed them because I was in debt, and because he said the papers were a partnership agreement, and I believed him. When I had a lawyer look at them later, which I should have done first, the lawyer told me the papers were not a partnership. They were a transfer. I had signed away my right to the water and to the land it ran beneath. I had also signed a statement saying I had entered the agreement willingly and without coercion, which I had not done, but the statement said I had. Edmund Voss told me the land was still mine to live on. He said he would not enforce the water transfer unless he had to. I understood what this meant. It meant I lived on his sufferance and not my own right. I left in the winter of 1871. I could not stay on land I did not own, doing work that would benefit a man who had taken from me what I had built. I am not a fighter. I know this about myself. But I am not nothing. I am leaving this here for whoever comes next, because whoever comes next has a right to know what this land is and what was done here. The water is real. The drawings will show you where it runs. If you are standing on this land, you are standing on the upstream end of a water vein that runs east. That matters. In this territory, the law says the upstream owner has first claim on the water. I learned this after it was too late to help me. Maybe it is not too late for you. I do not know where I am going. I am not asking for anything. I only want someone to know. It was signed. Josiah Marsh, November 1871. Elsa sat in the doorway of the cabin for a long time after she finished reading. The sun was fully down now, and the sky was going from dark blue to black, stars appearing one at a time in no particular order. The cricket sound that had started somewhere to the south was now coming from every direction at once. Edmund Voss. Rupert Voss's father. She thought about Rupert's face in the moment 2 weeks ago when he had handed her the envelope and explained, in his flat, precise way, The accounting that had reduced 6 years of her life to $9 and a list. She had looked for guilt in that face and not found it, which she had taken to mean there was none. Now she reconsidered. Guilt and absence of guilt looked nearly identical in a man who had learned very early that sentiment was a liability. She thought about Silas Oakes, his spectacles and his careful voice, and the way he had said nobody said when she asked about Josiah Marsh. The particular weight of those 2 words. She unfolded the map that had been tucked beneath the letter. It was drawn in pencil on drafting paper, and despite the years it was still readable in the parts that mattered. The well was marked. The basin was outlined. And from the well, drawn in a series of dotted lines that swept east and then angled northeast, was the path of the water vein as Marsh had mapped it. The dotted lines continued off the edge of the basin, over the east ridge, and into the territory beyond. Into the land that would eventually become, she now understood, the eastern holdings of the Voss family. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid. She had decided she was not going to be afraid. But because her mind was working, and she had not yet found a way to make it stop. She lay on her blanket with the letter on her chest and the compass in her hand, and she thought about what she had and what she knew, and what those 2 things together might be worth. She had 60 acres. She had clear title. She had a well with water in it. She had $340 in gold and silver coins. And she had a letter from a dead man, and a map, and a legal principle she had read about once in the surveying almanac and now wished she had read more carefully. Prior appropriation, the almanac had called it. The right of the first person to put water to beneficial use. In Wyoming territory, that right ran with the land, not with the person. The upstream owner came first. She turned the compass over in the dark. The brass was warm from her hand. For the one who stays. She stayed. By the 4th day she had made a list in her head, sorted by urgency. First, water in a container she could use without killing herself, which meant cleaning the well properly and testing it again. Second, a roof that didn't let Wyoming weather in, which meant cedar shingles or something close to them, which meant money, which she now had. Third, a door, which meant lumber, which she could get in Calderfield. Fourth, food, which was the most immediate problem and the one she'd been managing by not thinking about it too hard. On the morning of the 4th day, she found something else. She had been working on the lean-to, trying to assess whether it could be made functional or whether she should take it down for the lumber and start fresh, when she found the loose stone in the cabin's foundation. She had not gone looking for it. Her foot found it when she stepped on it and it shifted, and when she crouched down and looked at it, she saw that it was not just loose but deliberately removable, set with small chips of wood, packed around its edges in a way that kept it stable until you knew where to push. She pushed it and it came free. Behind it was a small space not large, the size of a hatbox, carved into the original ground before the foundation was laid. Inside was a single item wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out and unwrapped it. A journal, small, leather-bound, its cover soft with age. She opened it to the first page. Josiah Marsh had written his name on the inside cover, and below it, "This book is a record of the water I found and how I found it and what it means." Elsa sat with the journal in her lap for a long moment. Then she put it carefully inside her satchel, next to the letter and the map and the compass. Josiah Marsh had been thorough. She was beginning to understand why that mattered. She had 60 acres and a well with water in it, and a dead man's record of what lay beneath her feet. And Rupert Voss, she was certain now, had known about this land when he built his holdings east of here, had known about the water, had known what it was worth, and had been waiting, probably, for the county to quietly release the deed to some stranger who wouldn't know what they had, and then to make an offer that would seem generous to someone who didn't understand the word upstream. He had not counted on the stranger being Elsa Hale. She stood up, put the satchel on her shoulder, and looked at the basin around her. The morning light was coming over the east ridge, hitting the juniper on the slope and making the whole hillside look briefly gold before it settled back to ordinary green. The well stood at the center of the basin, its stone circle patient and permanent. The cabin behind her had good bones. She reached into the satchel and closed her fingers around Edmund Holt's hammer. She had work to do. The lumber cost more than she expected and less than she feared. Calderfield had one mill, operated by a man named Arlo Pruitt, who was not the kind of man who made small talk and appeared to regard it as a moral failing in others. He was broad through the shoulders and narrow through the conversation, with sawdust permanently embedded in the lines of his face, and hands that had the flattened, thickened look of hands that had spent decades in argument with large pieces of wood. When Elsa walked into his yard on the morning of the 5th day, he looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, as a problem that required categorizing before it could be addressed. She told him what she needed: cedar for shingles, planks for patching the floor and framing a door, a length of hardwood for the door itself. She described the dimensions of the opening from memory, the height and the width, and she was specific because Edmund had taught her that vague requests produced vague results, and vague results produced callbacks, and callbacks cost time. Pruitt listened without interrupting, which she took as a good sign. When she finished, he turned and walked into the mill without a word, and she followed him because it seemed like the thing to do. The mill smelled of cedar and pine resin, and the sweet particular smell of fresh-cut lumber that she associated, automatically and with a small pang, with Edmund's shop on days when he'd been working green wood. He showed her the cedar stalk. She ran her hand along the grain of the top log, and he watched her do it with the expression of a man who has seen people pretend to know what they're looking at and knows the difference between pretending and knowing. Straight grain, she said. No tension wood on this side. The other face. He turned the log without being asked, and she looked at the other face. That's better. I'd split from this end. She touched the end grain where the annual rings were tight and even. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then who taught you to read cedar? A man named Edmund Holt, Redstone. Something moved in his face, brief and real. Holt's dead. It was not a question. 4 months ago. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and started pulling lengths of hardwood from a rack along the wall, and the way he selected them was different from before, more careful. The way a man handles something he's decided is worth handling carefully. He did not explain the change, and she did not ask him to. Some things don't need articulating. The total came to $9 and some cents. She paid him from the gold coins, which he weighed on a small brass scale without comment, and he helped her load the lumber onto the handcart he lent her without being asked, which was the second change from before. You'll want straight nails, he said as she was leaving. He handed her a paper twist of hardware nails, perhaps 60 of them, their points sharp and their shanks unrusted. Crooked nails in good wood is a waste of good wood. She put the nails in her satchel and pulled the handcart up the road toward Dry Fork. It took most of the day. Her arms and shoulders told her about it for the next 2 days, which was fine. She had things to do. The roof took 11 days. Not because it was complicated. It was complicated, but complication was just another word for a problem that required sequential solutions, and she was good at sequences. It took 11 days because she was one person working alone, and because the south side of the roof had not just sagged but had partially detached from the ridge beam at the peak, which meant she had to get up there and reset the beam before she could lay a single shingle, and resetting a ridge beam alone, without anyone to hold one end, required a system of props and wedges and small incremental adjustments that took the better part of 3 days to work out. She fell once. Not far, maybe 8 feet off the low side of the roof onto the hard ground below, landing on her left side and lying there for a moment while she waited to find out what was broken. Nothing was broken. Her hip and shoulder would be various shades of purple for the next 2 weeks, and she found she could use the pain as a kind of timer. When it faded, she knew how much time had passed. By the time it was gone, the roof was done. The shingles she split herself in the evenings, working by firelight with the froe and mallet she'd bought in Calderfield. The froe was a simple tool, a long iron blade set perpendicular to a handle, and you drove it into the end grain of the cedar with the mallet, and the wood split along the grain in a clean, straight line. If you read the grain right. If you didn't, the split ran off at an angle, and you got a shingle that tapered wrong and wouldn't lay flat, and you had to start again. She got very good at reading the grain. The door she built from the hardwood planks and hung on iron hinges she'd brought from Calderfield. It fit the opening cleanly, with a gap at the bottom that she stuffed with rope oakum against the draft, and it swung on its hinges without binding. She checked the square 3 times before she set the pins. Edmund had told her that a door that doesn't hang square is a door that tells you something about the person who hung it, and she had taken this to heart in a way that was probably disproportionate to the original observation. For the window, she stretched a piece of canvas over the opening and tacked it to the frame. It was a temporary measure, and she knew it. It let in a diffused gray-white light on overcast days and a warmer amber light on sunny ones, and it kept the wind out well enough that she stopped waking in the night to find her blanket blown across the room. Somewhere in the second week, a woman appeared. Elsa was on the roof when she first heard the horse, the sound of hooves on the rocky ground coming up from the south. She kept working. If someone was coming to tell her she was trespassing on her own land, she preferred to hear it from a position of altitude. She drove the last 3 nails in the row she was working and then looked down. The woman on the horse was perhaps 55, with a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on her head, and the kind of face that had started out ordinary and become interesting over a long period of outdoor living. She sat a horse the way people do when they've been doing it since before they can remember, easily, without thinking about it. She was carrying something in one hand, a cloth-wrapped bundle, and she was looking up at Elsa on the roof with an expression that was not quite a smile but was moving in that direction. "I'm Dorothea Crane." Her voice was direct and unhurried. "My place is 3 miles east. I saw the smoke 2 weeks ago and I've been meaning to come by." Elsa climbed down the ladder she'd built from the leftover hardwood. When she reached the ground she was aware, for the first time in 2 weeks, of how she must look, sawdust and cedar resin in her hair. The bruising on her left side had faded to yellow at the edges but was still visible above her collar. Her hands were the kind of dirty that doesn't come off without soap and time. Dorothea was looking at the roof, at the work, not at Elsa. "You did that yourself?" The question carried no skepticism, only calculation, the way a person calculates when they're revising an estimate upward. "No one else here to do it." Dorothea swung down from the horse with the ease of long practice and handed over the cloth bundle. Inside was a loaf of bread, still slightly warm, and a paper-wrapped piece of hard cheese. "You can't build on nothing but well water and determination," she said. "Or you can for a while, but it catches up with you." They sat on the flat stone by the well, because there was nowhere else to sit, and ate the bread and cheese in the late afternoon light. Dorothea asked practical questions and Elsa answered them practically, and the conversation had a quality she recognized from working alongside Edmund. 2 people exchanging information, because the information was useful, without the social scaffolding that most conversations required. Dorothea had been at her place for 11 years. She ran cattle, not many, enough to be self-sustaining with a margin. She knew the land around Dry Fork, the way you know land you've looked at from a distance for a long time without having reason to approach it. She knew that the well had been considered dry. She did not say what she thought about it now, with the bucket sitting on the stone lip and the moisture around the base of the well. She noticed it, though. Elsa could see her noticing. "Whoever built this well knew what they were doing," Dorothea said, almost to herself. Her hand rested on the stone lip, reading the work the way Elsa had read the cedar. His name was Josiah Marsh. Dorothea's hand went still on the stone, just for a moment. Then she took it away and ate the last of her bread and did not say anything further about Josiah Marsh. And Elsa noted this and filed it and said nothing further about it either. Dorothea left when the light went gold and promised to come back. She did 3 days later, with eggs this time. And the visit after that, she brought a small crock of butter and the information, delivered casually as she was leaving, that Arlo Pruitt had been asking around town whether anyone knew who had taken up the Marsh place. Not in a suspicious way, Dorothea said. Just asking. Elsa absorbed this.
What did people say?
That a woman from Redstone had bought it. Some said Hale. Some said they'd heard it was a Voss girl, which I expect got started because of the name on the county records before it was transferred. Dorothea paused, her horse shifting under her. Rupert Voss's name has come up in connection with that land before, apparently. Old business. Nobody seemed sure of the details. After Dorothea left, Elsa stood by the well for a long time. The sun had gone and the stars were starting up, cold and clear. The eastern ridge was a dark line against the sky. Past that ridge was the land Rupert held, and below both pieces of land, connecting them in a way that Josiah Marsh had understood and drawn and hidden and Elsa had found, was the water. She went inside and opened Josiah Marsh's journal for the first time. He had been methodical. She had expected this from the letter, but the journal went further than she'd expected. He had recorded his observations over 3 years, the wet seasons and the dry ones, the way certain low spots in the basin held moisture longer than they should have given the surface drainage, the way the juniper on the north slope of the east ridge grew thicker and darker than juniper had any business growing on a dry hillside. He had dug test holes, 4 of them, marked on a sketch inside the front cover, and recorded what he found at each depth. At the 4th hole, 12 feet down in the rocky ground near the base of the east ridge, he had hit water. He had not stopped there. He had followed the signs east, crossing onto the neighboring property without, as he admitted in the journal, having permission to do so, and had found similar indicators of the same water vein extending into the eastern valley. He had made detailed notes on the indicators, the vegetation anomalies, the soil color changes at depth, the angle of the rock formations that would naturally channel underground water in this direction. And at the end of the journal, in the last few pages, he had written something that was less record and more testimony. He wrote about Edmund Voss, about the meeting and the papers and the realization afterward that he had been maneuvered with a professionalism that suggested it had been done before. He wrote, "A man who is practiced at this kind of taking does not practice on one person." Elsa sat with that sentence for a while. She turned to the sketch in the front cover, the 4 test holes marked with X's and their depths noted beside them. 3 of the holes were within the boundaries of Dry Fork. The 4th was just over the line onto the eastern property, which was now, after years of acquisition and the strategic patience of a man who played long games, Rupert Voss's land. She closed the journal and put it back in the satchel. She did not sleep much that night, but she was not anxious. She was solving. There was a difference between the kind of wakefulness that comes from fear and the kind that comes from a problem that has too many interesting dimensions to stop examining. This was the second kind. She lay on her blanket and worked through what she knew and what she still needed to know, and by the time the sky outside the canvas window began to gray, she had the shape of it. She needed someone who understood water law. She needed someone who could look at Josiah Marsh's map and his journal and tell her what they were worth as legal instruments. And she needed to know what Rupert Voss knew, exactly, and when he had known it, because the sequence mattered. She got up and went to work on the floor. The interior floor of the cabin was packed earth, which was not unusual, and was not insurmountable, but it was cold in the mornings and turned to mud in the corners when the moisture seeped in from the foundation. She had bought 12 planks from Pruitt on the first trip specifically for this, and she laid them now over a base of flat stone she'd been collecting from the hillside for the past week. The work was satisfying in the specific way that flooring is satisfying, because you start with ground and you end with a surface, and the transformation is both literal and complete. She was halfway through the 3rd plank when she heard a horse, then a second. She set the hammer on the rough table beside her and went to the door. 2 riders. They came down from the north ridge rather than up from the south road, which meant they had approached from the direction of the eastern valley, from Rupert Voss's side of the ridge. Elsa stood in her doorway and watched them come. She recognized Rupert Voss before he was close enough for details, recognized him by his posture, the particular way he sat a horse like a man who has always been on the winning side of physical negotiations and expects that to continue. He was wearing a gray coat she hadn't seen before, wool and well cut, and his hat was dark and new. He looked like a man who had dressed for something. The second rider was not someone she knew. He was younger, perhaps 40, lean, with a face that had been arranged by nature into an expression of pleasant attentiveness, and had been practiced there so long it had become fixed. His coat was black and his saddlebag was large, and the particular way he held it told her it contained papers. Rupert pulled up 10 feet from the cabin door and looked at the roof, looked at the door, then at Elsa. His face went through several calculations in the space of a second, adjustments to an expectation, and then settled into the expression she had known her whole life on his face, the expression of a man who has found a situation not quite to his preference but intends to manage it. "You've been busy." Not a compliment, an observation being filed. "I've been working." Elsa did not move from the doorway, which is different. The man in the black coat swung down from his horse. "Fletcher Odom," he extended his hand. "I represent certain interests in the territory regarding land and water rights. Mr. Voss has asked me to accompany him." His handshake, when she took it, was practiced, the grip calibrated to project confidence without aggression. She had met men like Odom before, not this man specifically, but the category of man, the kind who understood that a pleasant voice and good paper were more effective than raised voices, and who were correct about this. She invited them inside because she was not going to talk business in a doorway. They sat on the lumber scraps she'd been using as seats, which was not comfortable and was meant not to be. Rupert looked around the interior with an expression that was trying hard not to be impressed, and was not fully succeeding. He had expected, she understood, to find something closer to ruin, something closer to abandonment. He had expected to find her situation more precarious than it was. She waited. Odom opened his saddlebag and removed a folder of papers, which he placed on the plank she'd laid across 2 stumps as a rough table. He arranged them with the care of a man who understands that the physical arrangement of documents affects the emotional architecture of a conversation. "There's a legal complexity here," he began, his voice reasonable and unhurried, "that we thought it best to discuss directly with you, rather than through correspondence." "What complexity?" Elsa did not inflect it as a question. Josiah Marsh was never declared legally dead. Odom let that sit for a moment. "Which means that the property rights that pass through the county tax process are subject to challenge if Marsh or any legal heirs were to appear. It also means that any personal property Marsh may have left on the land at the time of his departure would technically remain his." A pause. "Or his estate's." Elsa looked at Rupert. He was looking at the floor plank she'd laid, at the grain of the wood, and she thought for a moment that he was actually seeing it, actually noticing the quality of the work, and that this was the one thing in the room that had reached him on a register beneath the transaction he'd come here to conduct. Then he looked up. "We're prepared to purchase the parcel at a fair price. $50. That's 33 times what for it." He said 33 times the way men say things when they want the number to feel large, and it was a large number, and he was not wrong that it was a large number. Elsa reached past him and picked up Edmund's hammer from where she'd left it on the fruffle. She turned it in her hands once, set it down between them. Not as a threat, as a fact. "I'll think about it," her voice even and without apology. "I'll need some time." Rupert's eyes went to the hammer, then back to her face. Something moved there briefly, something that was not quite the calculation she was used to seeing from him, and was perhaps something older than calculation. He had known Edmund Holt, not well, but enough to know the hammer. Odom collected his papers with the smooth efficiency of a man managing an outcome that was neither the best nor the worst he'd prepared for. He would be back, his manner said, without his manner saying it. They rode back north, up over the ridge toward the eastern valley, toward the land that sat downstream of this basin and had been waiting, Elsa now understood, for a very long time for whoever owned Dry Fork to either sell or give up. She stood in the doorway and watched them go until they were over the ridge and gone. Then she sat down on the stone by the well and put her face in her hands. Not in despair, in concentration. She was running through the sequence again, what she knew and what she needed and how much time she had, before Rupert decided that pleasant offers were no longer the most efficient instrument. $50. Which was nothing. Which was not even close to nothing. Which was the price of a problem he needed solved, offered to the person who was the problem. He knew about the water. She was certain now. The eastern land he'd been accumulating for the past 15 years was dry land with a water vein running beneath it that couldn't be fully accessed without the upstream rights. Dry Fork was the upstream. She was standing on it, and Josiah Marsh had known this in 1871, when Edmund Voss had come to him with papers and a pleasant voice, and the particular efficiency of a man who had done this kind of taking before. The journal was in her satchel. The letter was in her satchel. The map was in her satchel, and in the tin box under the floor plank she'd just laid, wrapped in the same oilcloth she'd found it in, was the compass with its 4 words scratched into the brass. She took the compass out and opened it. The needle swung and settled, north. She held it until the brass was warm from her hand and then put it back. She needed to find Everett Stoll. She had read Stoll's name in a notice posted in Calderfield 3 weeks ago, a small paper notice tacked to the board outside the land office, announcing that a survey team from the Wyoming Central Railroad was conducting geological assessments in the territory northeast of Calderfield in preparation for a possible route extension. The notice had listed a contact name, E. Stoll, Chief Survey Engineer, with an address at the survey camp being established near the town of Harwick, 12 miles northeast. She had not known when she read that notice why she was memorizing the name. She knew now. She went to Calderfield the next morning and sent a letter to the survey camp at Harwick, addressed to Everett Stoll. She described herself briefly, and her land briefly, and the geological feature she believed she had evidence for, without specifying what the evidence was, and asked whether he had any time in the next several weeks to conduct an assessment. She kept the letter factual and short, because factual and short letters get answered and long letters get set aside. She mailed the letter and walked back to Dry Fork. 3 days later, the answer arrived in the form of a rider from Calderfield, a single card in a plain envelope. Stoll's handwriting was cramped and efficient. He could come in 2 weeks. He was familiar with the Dry Fork area from survey maps. He had professional interest in underground water features in the territory. He would charge his standard assessment rate. She wrote back the same afternoon and confirmed. Then she went back to laying the floor. She finished the floor on the day Dorothea came back, which meant she had something to point at when Dorothea walked in and looked around. Dorothea looked at the floor, at the door, at the patched roof visible through the ceiling. She didn't say much, just stood in the middle of the room and turned around slowly, taking it in. And when she turned back to Elsa, her face had the expression of someone who had expected to feel one thing and found themselves feeling something else. Rupert Voss was here, Elsa said. Not a question. Dorothea didn't seem surprised that she knew. He came to my place 2 days after he was here. Said he was interested in acquiring land in the area. Said he'd heard the Marsh property had been claimed, and he wanted to know if the new owner was serious about staying. What did you tell him? Dorothea's expression did not shift. I told him I'd seen the roof and the door and the well, and that I had no reason to think she wasn't serious. Elsa absorbed this. Thank you, don't thank me. I didn't do it for you, exactly. I did it because I've watched that family acquire things in this territory for 20 years, and I'm tired of watching it. She set down the eggs she'd brought, a dozen this time, on the new floor plank. Josiah Marsh was a decent man who got taken. Everybody knew it and nobody did anything about it, including me. A pause. That's been sitting with me for a while. The nights were getting colder. September giving way to October, the mornings now with a hard edge that reminded you winter in Wyoming was not a metaphor. She stuffed the floor gaps with hemp oakum and chinked the worst of the log gaps on the north wall, with a mixture of clay and dried grass that Edmund had shown her, the old method, the one that worked. She got the stove functional enough to draw properly, replacing the collapsed section of pipe with a length she'd found in the collapsed lean-to that cleaned up better than expected. The goats she bought from Dorothea, 2 of them, a nanny and her yearling, for $4 total. She built a small pen from the leftover lumber scraps and the straightest of the fallen corral rails. The goats were not impressed with Dry Fork. They were not impressed with Elsa either, but they settled the way animals settle when the food is reliable and the shelter is adequate. She was 2 days out from Stoll's scheduled visit when the second thing happened. She came back from the creek one morning with a full bucket and found the pen door open and both goats gone. The pen latch was not broken. It had been lifted. From the outside, she found the goats a quarter mile to the south, loose on the road, unhurt and annoyed about the cold. She brought them back and rebuilt the latch with a secondary pin she bent from a nail, and she stood by the pen for a while and thought about what a lifted latch meant versus what a broken one meant. A broken latch was a message about force. A lifted latch was a message about access, about the fact that someone had been here, in the dark, on her land, close enough to the pen to lift the pin, and had chosen not to break anything, not yet, just to demonstrate that they could. She slept with Edmund's hammer next to her hand that night. 2 nights later she woke to the smell of smoke, not from her stove, from outside. She was on her feet and through the door in the time it took her heart to go from sleeping to full alarm, and she saw it immediately. The west side of the goat pen was burning, the dry lumber she'd used for the back wall catching fast in the cold October air, and the goats were screaming. That flat, high sound goats make that is almost human in its panic. She had the bucket before she was fully thinking. The well was 15 feet away and the water came up cold and full. She ran and threw and went back and threw again, and the fire was not large yet, not large enough to be beyond one person with a well and a bucket and the particular focused anger she was running on. On the 4th bucket the fire was out, and on the 5th she was sure it was out. The wood hissing and black, the goats pressed into the far corner of the pen shaking but breathing. She stood in the dark with the empty bucket in her hand. The October sky above was enormous and cold and full of stars that did not care about any of this. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the particular metabolic crash that follows the kind of sharp, total focus that fire demands. She breathed through it until it stopped. She looked at the burned wall. The damage was concentrated, not random. It had started in one corner, the corner furthest from the cabin and the well, the corner that would have been hardest for her to reach in the dark. Someone who had thought about this had chosen that corner. She went inside, relit the stove, sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and waited for her hands to fully stop shaking. When they did, she reached into the satchel and took out Josiah Marsh's journal and held it without opening it, just held the weight of it in her lap, the density of a man's careful attention pressed into a small leather cover. The journal smelled of old paper and something mineral. She wondered if it smelled of the water that had preserved it, the cold, dark water of the well, the same water that was flowing somewhere far below her, east toward the valley that Rupert Voss had been assembling piece by piece for 15 years, with the patience of a man who knew what he was waiting for. She put the journal down and picked up the compass, opened it. The needle swung and settled without hesitation. She thought about what it cost to do what had just been done. To come in the dark to the property of a woman who was known in Calderfield and known to Dorothea and known to Arlo Pruett, and set a fire and leave. It was the action of a man who had decided that subtlety was taking too long. The offer of $50 had been the last diplomatic instrument. This was the next one. She was not afraid. She had made the decision about fear and she was keeping it. But she was also not unaware that the decision about fear did not change what was true about her situation. She was one person. The lumber for a new pen wall would cost money she'd rather spend on winter provisions. The goats had to eat. The well needed a proper cover before the hard freeze came. And there was a category of pressure that could be sustained indefinitely by a man with resources, and could not be sustained indefinitely by a woman with a hammer and $300 in gold. Unless... She opened the journal to the page where Marsh had written about the fourth test hole, the one at the base of the east ridge, 12 feet down where the water was. She read it again carefully, as she had several times before, but now she was reading it with a specific question in mind. She was reading it to find the words that would matter to Everett Stoll. She found them quickly, because Marsh had been methodical and clear. He had described the rock formation angle. He had described the soil composition at depth. He had described the way the water moved when he reached it, not pooled but moving, which meant it was not a pocket but a flow. He had done this with the care of a man who understood, even in 1871. That description was the only tool he had. She turned to the map in the front cover. She looked at the dotted lines moving east. She thought about prior appropriation, which was Wyoming law and had been since the territory was organized. The principle that the first beneficial user of water had the superior right, and that right was attached to the land, not the person, and that upstream location mattered in determining who had first access to a shared source. She closed the journal. She thought, if Everett Stoll confirms what Josiah Marsh documented, if the water vein is real and is what Marsh said it was, if the upstream doctrine applies, then the $50 offer was not generosity. It was theft at a lower altitude than usual. The next morning, she walked the fence line of her 60 acres for the first time, with the specific purpose of understanding her boundaries, not just generally, but exactly, where the east line fell relative to the ridge, whether the fourth test hole Marsh had marked was within her parcel or on the line. She paced it out using the survey markers she'd found on the north corners, old iron stakes driven into rock that had gone orange with rust but were still plumb and readable. The fourth hole was inside her boundary, by perhaps 40 feet. 40 feet of margin between her claim and the eastern property. 40 feet between the evidence of the water and Rupert Voss's land. 40 feet. She stood at the east boundary line and looked across the ridge at the land beyond it. Somewhere beyond that ridge, in the valley she couldn't see from here, Rupert Voss was doing whatever Rupert Voss did on a Tuesday morning in October. In the house she imagined was large and warm, and had a cook and a man who saw to the horses, and he was doing it with the confidence of a man who has always understood that patience is just another form of pressure, and that pressure, given enough time, resolves most problems in his favor. She picked up a stone from the ground at her feet, looked at it, put it in her pocket. A small piece of Dry Forks rock, reddish-brown and dense, rough on one side and worn flat on the other where water or time had worked it. She turned and walked back to the cabin. Everett Stoll arrived 2 days later, early in the morning, on a bay horse with a canvas roll strapped behind the saddle and a leather case across his back that clinked quietly when he moved. He was younger than she'd expected from the authority in his letter. Late 30s, she guessed, lean and weathered in the particular way of men, who spend most of their time outdoors without being vain about it. He had a precise, unhurried quality about him, the quality of a man who had learned that accuracy mattered more than speed, and had organized his habits around this. He looked at the well first thing, without being asked, and the way he looked at it told her he had been looking at geological features for long enough that he did it automatically. He crouched by the base of the well and pressed his palm to the ground and held it there. "When did you get water?" His voice was direct. No preamble. Third day of clearing the blockage. The well had been sealed off by a collapsed interior structure. Rotted cover. He looked up at her. Something had sharpened in his attention. "How deep before you hit flow?" "Approximately 11 feet. She had measured afterward. "The flow is consistent. The temperature is cold even in the afternoon. It's not pooled. It moves." He stood up. "I need to see your documentation." She brought the satchel and laid out the map and the journal on the stone by the well. He read without speaking for a long time, not skimming, reading. His finger traced the dotted lines on Marsh's map, and then lifted and pointed east toward the ridge, with the natural gesture of a man whose hands think alongside his mind. "Josiah Marsh," he said, not asking. He was the original claimant. He documented this vein in 1869 through 1871. Stoll looked at the ridge, then at the map again, then at Elsa. "I've seen the geological surveys for the Eastern Valley, from the territorial assessment in 1882. There's an anomaly in them that I've been trying to account for. A water indicator that the survey team documented but didn't follow up on because it wasn't directly relevant to the railroad question." He tapped Marsh's map. This would explain it. He spent 4 hours on the property. He took samples from the soil near the base of the ridge. He examined the vegetation on the slope. He lowered his own measuring line into the well and confirmed the depth and the flow. He walked the east boundary line and stood where Elsa had stood 2 days before, looking over the ridge, and he stood there for a long time. When he came back to where she was waiting at the well, his expression was not excited. It was something quieter than excited. The expression of a man who has confirmed something he suspected, and is now dealing with the weight of having confirmed it. "The vein is real," he said. "It's larger than Marsh estimated. It runs southeast as well as east, which he didn't map because he couldn't follow it that far from this location." A pause. "The upstream doctrine applies. This parcel is upstream of everything in the Eastern Valley. That means, under Wyoming law as it currently stands, the owner of this parcel has a superior right to the beneficial use of this water over any downstream claimant, regardless of when the downstream claimant began use." Elsa kept her face still. "Would you put that in writing? I'll prepare a formal assessment." He was looking at the ridge again. "I should tell you that the value of what you have here is not small." He said it carefully, like a man who has learned that telling people the value of things changes how they behave, and that the change is not always for the better. People have gone to considerable lengths over less. She looked at the burn mark on the west wall of the goat pen, visible from where they were standing. He followed her gaze and looked at it for a moment. "I see," he said. He stayed 1 more hour, writing in his own notebook with the steady concentration of a man who takes the recording of things seriously. And then he rode back north toward Harwick, promising the written assessment within the week. Elsa watched him go. The afternoon was still. The goats were quiet in their pen. The well sat at the center of the basin, its stones patient and permanent, doing what they had been built to do for 20 years without anyone to benefit from it, just waiting for the right person to clear what was blocking it. She put her hand on the stone lip of the well. The stone was cold from the shadow. Below it, somewhere deep and real and running, the water moved. It had always been there. Someone had always known it, and now so did she. Everett Stoll's written assessment arrived on a Thursday 7 days after his visit, delivered by a rider from Harwick who handed it to Elsa at the well and left without waiting for a reply. She read it standing up. She read it twice. It was 4 pages in Stoll's cramped, precise hand, and it was thorough in the way that only documents written by people who understand that their words will be used in arguments they won't personally attend can be thorough. He had described the geological formation in technical language, and then translated it into plain language in parentheses, as if he had anticipated that the document would need to be understood by people who were not geologists and had decided to accommodate them without condescending to them. He had referenced the territorial survey records from 1882 to the ones that contained the anomaly he'd mentioned, and he had drawn the explicit connection between that anomaly and what Josiah Marsh had documented in 1871. He had cited the prior appropriation doctrine by its formal territorial legal citation, and at the bottom of the 4th page, in a paragraph that was separate from the technical content by a line of space, he had written something that was not strictly part of a geological assessment. He had written, "It is my professional judgment that the water resource documented here represents a significant and currently underutilized asset. The upstream position of this parcel relative to the Eastern Valley holdings is unambiguous. Any individual or entity seeking to develop the eastern water access without the cooperation of the upstream owner would face substantial legal and practical obstacles under current Wyoming territorial law." She folded the document and put it in the satchel with the letter and the map and the journal. Then she sat down on the stone lip of the well and thought about what came next. The rumor had already started. She had not started it. She did not know who had, though she had suspicions that leaned toward Rupert Voss's camp, where starting rumors was probably categorized as an administrative function. The rumor, in the version she'd heard it from Dorothea 4 days after the fire, was that Elsa Hale had found something valuable on the Marsh property and was refusing to sell because she believed she could get more than it was worth. The implication being that she was greedy. The secondary implication being that she was naive. Both implications designed to make the town feel that her refusal to sell was the problem, not the offer itself. She had heard the version Arlo Pruitt had gotten, which was slightly different. In Pruitt's version, which he had conveyed to Dorothea, who had conveyed it to Elsa with the compressed efficiency of a woman who understood that information was best transmitted without decoration. The story was that Elsa had stolen property belonging to the Marsh estate and was attempting to sell it herself. Stolen. The word had a specific legal weight in a territory where courts were still working out what they thought about property rights, and where a woman alone on 60 acres of contested land had fewer presumptions in her favor than she might have liked. She went to see Boyd Calloway. The sheriff's office in Calderfield was a small building at the east end of the main street, between the feed store and a vacant lot that had been optimistically fenced but never built on. Calloway was behind his desk when she came in. He was a man who gave the impression of having been at that desk for a long time, and intending to be there for considerably longer. Not from complacency, but from the particular steadiness that some people arrive at after enough years of watching situations develop and resolve. He listened to everything she said without interrupting. This was one of his professional qualities. He did not take notes, which she thought at first was a bad sign, but she realized after a few minutes that he was the kind of man who retained things and didn't need to write them down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then the fire. "Yes. You didn't come to me about the fire," he said it without accusation, just observing the sequence. "No. Why not?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "Because I didn't have anything useful to give you, and I needed time to understand what I had." He considered this. "And now you have Stoll's assessment, and the letter, and the map, and the journal." She had brought all of it, the whole satchel, and she set it on his desk now. He looked at the satchel but didn't open it yet. He looked at her instead, with the particular attention of a man who has learned that the person in front of him is usually as important as the document. "What do you want from me, Miss Hale?" "I want the record to show that I came to you with these documents, that I presented them voluntarily, that the assessment by Stoll is in your custody as well as mine." She paused. "And I want someone with a badge to know the sequence of events. The offer, the latch, the fire, the timing." Calloway's expression did not change, but something behind it did. He leaned forward and opened the satchel. He read for a long time. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one. He read Marsh's letter twice, as she had, and he read Stoll's assessment in full, including the technical sections, which she had not expected. When he closed the last page, he leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Edmund Voss," he said, not to her. To himself or to the ceiling or to some running account he kept in his head. "Well, you knew him. I knew of him." A pause. "The way you know of a weather pattern, by what it does to the landscape." He looked at her. "Rupert runs the same way, just with better manners. She waited. Calloway stood up. Not dramatically. Just stood. The way a man stands when he has made a decision and the decision involves movement. I'm going to make copies of these documents. He held up a hand before she could speak. For the office records, the originals stay with you. And starting today, I'll be making a weekly ride out to Dry Fork. A pause. Not because you can't handle yourself, because presence matters. And because whoever set that fire should understand that this office is paying attention. She thanked him. He looked faintly uncomfortable with the thanks. Don't thank me, I'm doing the job. Then, after a moment, Silas Oakes has been wanting to talk to you. He came by here last week asking if I'd seen you. Said it was important. She went to see Silas Oakes the same afternoon. The land office was quiet at 4 in the afternoon. Oakes was at his desk and he stood when she came in, which she had not expected, and which cost him something. She could see that it cost him something. The particular effort of a man whose joints had opinions about being asked to stand. He gestured to the chair across from him and this time she sat. He had something on the desk between them. An envelope, older than the one he'd stamped her deed from. Its paper yellowed and its seal long since broken and reclosed with a length of red string. He looked at it, and then at her, and then he put his hands flat on the desk on either side of it. The posture of a man who is about to say something he has been preparing to say for a long time. I have been in this office for 22 years, he began. His voice was the same dry paper voice, but it was doing something different today. It was carrying weight. I was here in 1871. I was not yet old enough to know what courage cost. Old enough to see what was happening. Not old enough to do anything about it. A pause. Edmund Voss brought Josiah Marsh into this office on a Tuesday in October of that year. Marsh signed papers. The papers were presented to me for recording in the official county ledger. Another pause, longer this time. I recorded them, because that was my function. Elsa kept very still. What I should have done, Oakes continued, and his voice was careful and deliberate, was ask Marsh directly whether he understood what he was signing. I did not do this because Edmund Voss was standing next to him, and Edmund Voss had a way of being in a room that made certain questions feel like they had already been answered. He looked at his hands. I have thought about that Tuesday many times since. He pushed the envelope across the desk. Before Marsh left town, he came back here. Alone. He gave me this envelope and asked me to keep it. He said if anyone ever came asking about that piece of land, I was to give them this. A pause. You are the first person who has come asking. She picked up the envelope. It was light. Inside, when she opened it, was a single folded document. She unfolded it and read it, and her hands were steady, and her face was still, and inside her chest, something was happening that she could not have put a name to if she'd tried. It was a copy of Thomas Hale's last will and testament. Not her father's will. Her father had been Thomas Hale. Yes, but this was a different document than she'd known existed. It was dated 3 weeks before her parents died, witnessed by 2 names she recognized as Redstone residents who had since moved on. It was brief and clear. It directed that the mercantile and all assets of the Hale household were to pass to Elsa Hale upon her reaching adulthood, defined in the document as 21 years of age. It specified that no interim guardian had authority to sell or transfer any part of the estate without a court order. It named Silas Oakes as the document's keeper. She looked up from the page. Oakes met her eyes. Your father brought it to me personally. He said he didn't trust it to stay in Redstone because of Rupert Voss. A pause. Thomas Hale was a careful man. He had been watching his brother-in-law for several years, and he did not like what he saw. Rupert was not her father's brother. He was her mother's brother. She had always thought of Rupert as being connected to her father's side, because the mercantile had been her father's family's business, but Rupert was a Voss through her mother, and the name Edmund Voss in Josiah Marsh's letter now had a different resonance. The Voss family did not have one way of operating. They had a pattern that had been running for decades. He forged a document, she said, not a question. He presented a document to the county probate court in Redstone that gave him guardianship authority over your parents' estate. I never saw that document, but I heard about it, and the description of it does not match what your father left with me. Oakes's voice was flat and factual. I should have come forward then. I did not. She folded her father's will and put it in the satchel with the rest of it. The satchel was getting full. She looked at Oakes. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down and is not yet sure how to feel about being lighter. She thought about what it cost him to have kept this for 18 years and what it cost him now to give it up, and she thought that both of those things had cost him more than either one showed on the surface of his face. "Will you say this in public?" she asked. "What you've told me, in front of other people." He straightened his shoulders. The effort of it was visible. "That is why I asked to speak with you," he said. "I'm old. My knees hurt and my eyes are worse than I let on, and I have perhaps one significant act left in me." He looked at the desk, then back at her. "I intend to use it correctly this time." She walked back to Dry Fork that evening instead of waiting for a wagon. She needed the time. 14 miles and a sky going orange and then purple and then black, and her mind running through the sequence with the focus she usually reserved for complicated joinery. The kind where 4 pieces have to meet at once and you have to cut each one in relation to all the others. What she had, her deed, clean and stamped. Dole's assessment, professionally prepared and technically sound. Marsh's letter, Marsh's journal, Marsh's map. Her father's will properly witnessed and held by a county official. And Silas Oakes willing to speak. What Rupert had, money. Odom. Political relationships in the territory. 18 years of established landholding. And the particular confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. She thought about what kind of challenge would reach him. Not a legal one, though the legal one was real and would matter eventually. Rupert would drag a legal case out for years if he chose to, and he had the resources to make years of delay feel comfortable while it ground away at her. She needed something that worked faster. She needed something public. The town meeting was the following Thursday. She had seen the notice on the board in Calderfield a week ago, a regular monthly gathering at the meeting hall, where civic business was discussed and where Rupert Voss, she had learned from Dorothea, was planning to present a development proposal for the Eastern Valley. A proposal that involved, at its core, the water rights that she was now quite certain he did not actually have and had never actually had. She went home and she slept, and in the morning she got up and went to work. 3 days before the meeting she walked to Calderfield and sent a note to Everett Stoll at Harwick, asking whether he could attend a public meeting on Thursday. She sent a note to Boyd Calloway, telling him the same. She went to Dorothea's place and sat at her kitchen table for an hour, and told Dorothea everything, all of it, the full sequence from Marsh to Edmund Voss to her father's will to the fire, and Dorothea listened without interrupting, which was a quality Elsa had come to understand was rarer than it appeared. When she was done, Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to do this in public." Not disapproving, clarifying. "He's going to present a proposal to the town based on water rights he doesn't have. I'm going to be there when he does." Dorothea looked at her across the kitchen table. "He has friends in that room, I know. He has the mayor. I know. And you have an old land clerk and a railroad engineer and me." A pause. "And yourself." Elsa met her eyes. "That's been enough so far." Dorothea was quiet again for a moment. Then she stood up and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one in front of Elsa, and kept one for herself, and sat back down. "All right," she said. Thursday. The Thursday morning arrived with the particular quality of Wyoming October mornings, sharp and clear, the sky a hard blue with no clouds, and the sage on the hillside silver with frost that hadn't quite burned off by 9 o'clock. Elsa dressed in the cleanest clothes she had, which was not a dramatic statement but was a deliberate one. She put the satchel over her shoulder. She put Edmund's hammer in her coat pocket, not because she intended to use it for anything, but because the weight of it was useful. She walked to Calderfield. The meeting hall was a long building that served as the schoolroom during the week and the community space on evenings and Sundays. By 9:30 it was already more than half full, which was a larger attendance than a regular monthly meeting usually drew, which told her that the word about Rupert's proposal had circulated and that people were interested in what they were going to be offered. Rupert was at the front of the room with Odom and 2 other men she didn't know, well-dressed. The kind of men who travel with other men to suggest that important people have gathered around them. There were maps on a table at the front, large printed maps, the kind that cost money to have made, showing the Eastern Valley with lines and notations that Elsa could read from her position in the 3rd row but was pretending not to be reading. Rupert saw her when she came in. His face registered it and then smoothed out, the adjustment so fast and practiced that if she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. Odom, sitting beside him, also saw, and his adjustment was different. His was the adjustment of a man running a rapid calculation about what her presence meant for the plan he had prepared for the morning. Stoll was in the back of the room, which she saw when she turned to look. He had come from Harwick, a long ride for a Thursday morning, and he was sitting with his notebook closed on his knee and his expression neutral. The expression of a man who is there in a professional capacity and is being careful about what his face says before the professional part begins. He caught her eye and gave a small nod. Calloway was near the door, standing, not sitting. His badge was visible. He was not there to participate. He was there the way he'd said he would be, making presence matter. Silas Oakes was in the second row. He had come from his office, which was in this building, 2 doors down, and he had the look of a man who had prepared himself for something in the way that people prepare for things they have been dreading for a long time and have finally decided to stop dreading. The meeting was called to order by the mayor, a man named Hobart who wore his civic authority like a new coat, a little stiff and self-conscious about it. There was some routine business, a road repair, a school schedule matter, and then Rupert stood and the room gave him its attention, in the way that rooms give attention to men who are used to having it. He was a good speaker. Elsa had forgotten this, or had not focused on it before, because his speaking had always been directed at her in private, and in private his manner was different. But here, in front of 40 people, he was smooth and considered, and made the whole thing sound inevitable. He spoke about the Eastern Valley's potential, about water development, about what responsible land management looked like, about jobs and growth and the territory's future. He gestured at the maps on the table. He spoke about water rights in the kind of general terms that sounded authoritative to people who did not know the specifics. He was almost finished when Elsa stood up. She did not ask permission. She stood up and the room shifted, not dramatically, just the small collective adjustment that happens when a room notices something it didn't expect to notice. The water rights you're describing. Her voice was steady and clear and not loud. You didn't need to be loud in a room this size if you were speaking from your chest. Belonged to the upstream parcel, which is mine. She opened the satchel. I have a geological assessment prepared by Everett Stoll, who is present here today. I have the original documentation of the water vein, prepared by Josiah Marsh, who held the upstream claim before it was taken from him. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of people listening, the sharp quiet of people who have understood that they are in the middle of something real. Rupert's face was controlled. Odom had gone very still. The 2 other well-dressed men were exchanging a look that meant they were doing calculations they had not expected to need to do. The Marsh parcel was acquired under legal title through the county. Rupert's voice was steady, professionally so, and any claims about historical documentation are a matter for the courts, not a town meeting. Elsa looked at him across the room. You're right that the courts are one place this could go. She kept her voice even and unhurried. But the people in this room are being asked to support a development proposal based on water rights that are currently under dispute. They should know that before they support it. She looked at the fees around her, not all of them sympathetic, some of them clearly uncertain which way to fall, but all of them listening. Mr. Stoll. Stoll stood from the back of the room. He was brief and technical, and he used the plain language version of his report, the version he had apparently prepared for exactly this kind of situation. Because he was a man who thought ahead. He described the water vein. He described its upstream position. He described what prior appropriation meant in practical terms for any downstream development that had not secured the upstream consent. He said it all in 4 minutes, standing at the back of the room with his notebook in his hand. The room was still very quiet. Odom leaned to Rupert and said something that no one else could hear. Rupert's jaw tightened. A small movement. The kind of movement that happens when a man is deciding whether to push forward or redirect. He chose redirect. These are disputed claims, he said, addressing the room rather than Elsa, trying to reclaim the address. The professional stance of a man managing a complication rather than facing a challenge. The legal process exists for exactly this kind of dispute. I suggest we table the water discussion until the legal questions are resolved and return to the matter of Silas. She said it quietly, not loudly. Just his name. Oak stood up from the second row. He was old and his knees hurt, and he held the edge of the bench in front of him for a moment before he was fully upright. Then he let go of the bench and stood on his own. The room's quiet changed quality again. Because Silas Oakes had been in this county for 22 years, and had been in that chair in the second row at every monthly meeting for most of them. And people knew him the way people know furniture, as a given, as a fixed point, and watching him stand up and prepare to speak felt like watching something structural rearrange itself. I was present, Oak said, in October of 1871, when Edmund Voss brought Josiah Marsh into the land office to sign documents that Marsh believed were a partnership agreement and that were in fact a transfer of his water rights. His voice was dry and clear, and he did not look at Rupert while he said it. He looked at the room. I recorded those documents. I should have asked Marsh directly whether he understood what he was signing. I did not. A pause. I have been carrying that for 18 years. I am setting it down now. Rupert said, "My father, I am not finished." Oak said it without raising his voice. He said it the way a very old man says something when he has decided it will be the last significant thing he says and he intends to say it correctly. I am also in possession of the last will and testament of Thomas Hale, father of Elsa Hale, who is standing in this room. That document was entrusted to me by Thomas Hale personally before his death. It directs that the Hale mercantile and all associated assets were to pass to his daughter at her majority, without the authority of any guardian to sell or transfer those assets without a court order. Now he looked at Rupert, directly, steadily. That document was never presented to the probate court in Redstone. The room was so quiet that Elsa could hear the wood of the benches settling. Rupert's face had gone through several things in the past 30 seconds and had arrived at something she had never seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation. Something that was the residue of those things after the control that usually managed them had been briefly, visibly interrupted. It lasted only a moment. Then the control came back, as it always did with men like Rupert Voss, because control was what they had instead of other things. Odom put his hand on Rupert's arm, low at his side where most of the room couldn't see it. The gesture of a man who is telling his client to stop. Rupert looked at Odom. Something passed between them that was brief and without words and that landed like a conclusion. Rupert turned and walked out of the meeting hall. Not fast, not in visible anger. He walked the way men walk when they have decided that staying is no longer serving a purpose, with the deliberate pace of someone who intends to be seen walking, not fleeing. Odom followed him. The two other well-dressed men gathered the printed maps from the table without looking at anyone and followed Odom. The door closed behind them. The room held its silence for another moment. Then Hobart, the mayor, cleared his throat in the particular way of men who are tasked with managing in the aftermath of things that have just happened in rooms they are responsible for. He said something about tabling the proposal pending legal review. Someone seconded it. The routine machinery of civic process resumed, a little unevenly, like a clock that had been bumped. Elsa sat down. She put the satchel on her lap and put her hands on it and breathed. Around her, people were talking, the low murmur of a room that has witnessed something and is working out what it thinks about what it witnessed. She heard her name several times. She did not turn around. She looked at the front of the room where the table stood with nothing on it now. The maps gone. The space where Rupert's proposal had been physically laid out now, just empty wood. Dorothea sat down beside her, having moved from somewhere in the middle of the room. She did not say anything. She just sat there, which was enough. Stoll made his way from the back of the room to where she was sitting, and he had his notebook open to a new page. "I'll have the formal assessment updated with the new legal context within the week," his voice low and professional. "The Marsh documentation significantly strengthens the upstream claim. Combined with the will, you have a case that most territorial courts would find straightforward. How long would a court case take?" He was honest about it. Months at minimum. Possibly more than a year, depending on how it's contested. She nodded. She had expected this. Boyd Calloway appeared at the end of the row. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he gave the same small nod he'd given from his desk when she'd told him the sequence. Then he moved toward the door, back to his position, back to his job. After the meeting emptied, she sat in the hall for a few minutes with Dorothea. The room was quiet, the way rooms are quiet after they've been full, a little hollow. The warmth of people's bodies still in the air, but the people themselves gone. The maps of Rupert's Eastern Valley proposal were nowhere. Just the table. She thought about what had happened and tried to be precise about what it was. Rupert had not confessed. Odom had not conceded. No court had ruled. No check had been written. What had happened was that the shape of the situation had become visible to the 40 people in that room, and those 40 people would talk to 40 more, and the story that Rupert had been using, that Elsa was confused or greedy or wrong, had been replaced in public by a different story, one that included Josiah Marsh and Edmund Voss and a Tuesday in 1871 and the will of a careful man who had not trusted what he saw in his brother-in-law. Stories mattered in small territories. They mattered the way weather mattered, not in the short term necessarily, but in the aggregate, in what accumulated over time and shaped how things grew. Outside the meeting hall the air was cold and the sky was still the hard blue it had been in the morning, unchanged by everything that had happened inside. She stood on the step and looked down the main street of Calderfield, at the feed store and the land office and the hotel with its 2 stories, and the flag outside the county building hanging slack in the still air. Oakes came out behind her, moving slowly, carefully, the movement of a man who has spent something and knows it, and has decided it was worth spending. She stood aside to let him pass, but he stopped next to her instead. "Your father was a good man," he said. "He would have done the same for you that you've done here today." She thought about her father, about Thomas Hale and his painted sign and his careful habits, and the will he had written and trusted to a man he'd barely known, acting on an instinct that had turned out to be correct. The will had survived. Oakes had survived. The truth had survived. 18 years in a county land office, waiting for the right question to be asked. You do the right thing in the right moment and then you let it go, she thought. You can't control when the right moment arrives. You can only be ready. He prepared for things he hoped wouldn't happen, she said. That's a different kind of courage than most people recognize. Oakes was quiet. Then he went back inside to his office. She walked to the well at Dry Fork. She always walked it. 3 hours. Her legs knew every rise and turn of it now, knew where the road got rocky and where it softened near the creek, and where the juniper came close on both sides and the light went dim and green even on a bright day. She got home as the sun was going down. The cabin was warm from the banked fire. The goats were settled in the repaired pen. The well sat at the center of the basin in the long low light, its stone circle casting a short shadow east. She sat on the step and opened the satchel and took out the compass, held it in both hands. She was not naive about what came next. Rupert would not simply accept what had happened in that room. Men like Rupert did not simply accept things. He would talk to Odom. He would talk to the mayor, and whoever the mayor talked to, and whatever legal mechanisms he could reach. He would look for angles she hadn't anticipated because that was what he did. But he was doing it now, from a position that was different from the one he'd been in this morning. He was doing it from a position where 40 people knew what Silas Oakes had said, and 40 people had heard Everett Stoll's name attached to a professional document, and 40 people had seen Rupert Voss walk out of a room without answering the questions that room had just put to him. Walking out was not nothing. Walking out was data. She turned the compass over in her hands. The brass was warm from her grip. She opened it and the needle swung and found north without hesitation, without confusion, the same way it had been finding north for 20 years in the dark at the bottom of a well. She thought about Josiah Marsh, who had not been a fighter, who had said this about himself in his letter without apology, just as information. He had not been a fighter. He had been a documenter. He had trusted that the documentation would outlast the injustice, that if he recorded the truth carefully enough in enough places, in a letter and a journal and a map and a compass, with 4 words scratched into the lid, something true would eventually survive to the right person. Something true would eventually survive to the right person. She had been the right person. She hadn't known it when she walked into the land office in Calderfield with 7.5 and her name. She hadn't known it when she first set foot in this basin and looked at the well and the sagging cabin and the juniper hills. She hadn't known what she was walking into. But she had known what Edmund Holt had taught her. She had known how to look at something broken and see what it still had in it. She had known that weathered was not the same as ruined, and that sound bones were where you started, not where you ended. The sun was down now. The stars were starting. The well was dark and still, and the sound of the water in it, which she had learned to hear on quiet nights, a very faint low sound that was more felt than heard, was there. She put the compass in her pocket. She went inside and put more wood on the fire and pulled the door shut behind her, the door she had built and hung and leveled herself, and it closed cleanly and completely in its frame, not binding, not sticking, sitting exactly as it should, because she had cut it right. Rupert Voss made his next move 9 days after the town meeting. Not immediately. That was the thing about men like Rupert. They did not react in the open. They regrouped somewhere private, recalculated at a desk no one else sat at, and waited long enough that the response arrived at a moment when you had almost begun to believe it wasn't coming, which was itself the strategy. The waiting, as deliberate as everything else he did. The move came in the form of a letter, delivered to Calderfield's post office and forwarded to Dry Fork by a rider Dorothea sent. The firm's name on the letterhead had 3 parts, and an address in Cheyenne that sounded expensive. The language inside was dense and impersonal, the kind of document designed to overwhelm through volume rather than through any single clear threat. But the substance, once she read through the density twice, was this. The firm represented Rupert Voss and certain associated business interests. They were formally contesting the county's transfer of the Marsh parcel on the grounds that the original tax assessment had been improperly administered. They were also asserting a claim against the personal property recovered from the parcel, specifically the contents of the tin box, on the basis that Josiah Marsh remained legally alive, and any property belonging to his estate could not pass to a subsequent deed holder by right of discovery alone. They were requesting that all relevant documentation be surrendered to their office, pending court review. She read the letter once, folded it, put it in the satchel. Then she sat for a while and thought about the specific tactic being used, which was not new, which was as old as contested land itself. Not to win immediately. To make winning expensive enough for the other side that they quit before the winning is required. It cost Rupert nothing to file a contestation. What it cost was her time and her money and the slow grinding weight of uncertainty, which landed differently on a woman alone on 60 acres than it landed on a man with a Cheyenne law firm and a valley full of Eastern holdings. She had expected something. She had not expected the Cheyenne firm, which was a larger instrument than she'd anticipated. And that told her something important, something she sat with for a full minute before she let herself feel the weight of it. You don't hire a Cheyenne firm for 60 acres of rocky land and a well. You hire a Cheyenne firm for something you cannot afford to lose. Which meant she had been right about the water from the beginning. She went to see Boyd Calloway the next morning. He read the letter with the same unhurried care he applied to everything, and when he set it down he looked at her with the expression of a man being precise rather than kind. They're going after the chain of title. If they can void the original county transfer, your deed goes with it. Can they? He was quiet a moment. The tax assessment process in '73 was clean. Oaks administered it. The records are sound. A pause. Whether a Cheyenne firm finds a judge willing to look at it differently is a question I can't answer with certainty. She had expected honesty and received it. And the tin box contents. Marsh not being legally dead is a real problem for that claim. The argument they'd make is that whatever was in that well remained his property regardless of what happened to the land above it. He looked at the letter one more time. What would resolve it is either Marsh confirmed dead by a court process, or documentation that he himself transferred those specific items by intention. She looked at him. The letter, Calloway said. The one addressed to whoever finds this. A court could read that as a transfer by intention under abandonment doctrine. It's not settled law. But it's an argument worth making. She needed a lawyer, not Putnam, who handled small-town wills and had already told Dorothea that the Cheyenne firm's involvement was beyond him. She needed someone who practiced territorial law at the level where water rights and estate claims and contested deeds lived. Someone who had faced the judges that Rupert's firm would be standing in front of. She went to Everett Stoll at the survey camp outside Harwick, 3 hours north on a borrowed horse, arriving in cold November air with the first smell of serious snow coming off the mountains. He read the Cheyenne letter at his drafting table and leaned back and looked at the tent ceiling. Voss moved faster than I expected. I need a name. A territorial lawyer. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was being careful about the recommendation, rather than uncertain about the answer. There's a woman in Laramie named Adeline Foss. She handles water rights specifically. I've worked with her on 2 railroad assessments where access was in dispute. He said it with the steadiness of someone prepared to stand behind what they were saying. She's not cheap. How not cheap? More than you want to spend. Less than losing. He found a card in his notebook and wrote the name and address and tore it out. One more thing. He went to the map rack along the tent wall and unrolled a large survey document on the drafting table, the territorial railroad assessment from 1882 that he'd mentioned before. His finger rested on a notation in the Eastern Valley section. The surveyor who made this anomaly notation was a man named Calhoun. He's retired now, in Laramie as it happens. I reached out to him last week after the town meeting. He looked at her steadily. He remembers the notation. He remembers being told to move on past it, and he remembers who told him to move on. She waited. The man who contracted that survey, who had Eastern Valley holdings and an interest in the route assessment, not drawing attention to what lay beneath them. Another pause. Rupert Voss suppressed a water indicator in a Federal Railroad survey in 1882. Calhoun is willing to put that in writing. She rode back to Dry Fork in the dark, the borrowed horse knowing the road, and she stood in the cold cabin for a long time without lighting the lamp, thinking. Running the sequence the way she ran joinery calculations, every piece in relation to all the others. What Rupert had on his side, money, odom, political relationships, 18 years of established holding, and the confidence of a man who had never been seriously checked. What she had, a sound D. Stoll's assessment, Marsh's letter and journal and map, Oakes willing to testify, and now Calhoun and the 1882 survey, and 260 remaining from the tin box after 5 months of building. She wrote to Adeline Foss that night by lamplight, 3 pages organized by sequence, every piece laid out in order. She described the property, the deed, the contents of the tin box, the Cheyenne firm's letter, Stoll's assessment, Oakes and what he'd witnessed in 1871, and finally Calhoun and the suppressed survey notation. She did not editorialize. She asked Foss to tell her what the sequence was worth. She mailed it the next morning and went back to work. The first hard freeze came at the end of that week and she was ready for it. Wood stacked, north wall fully chinked, the goat pen roofed properly. She and Arlo Pruitt had done that together the week before, working in the cold with the particular focused efficiency of 2 people who both disliked wasted motion. The goats were unhappy about the cold but fed and sheltered and would survive it. She had learned that unhappiness and unsafety were not the same condition, in goats or in people. 12 days after she sent her letter, Foss's reply arrived, 1 page. The handwriting was decisive, pressed hard into the paper. Foss had reviewed the summary. She believed the case had significant merit on all 3 fronts: deed validity, estate property, water rights. She noted the 1882 survey interference element with what Elsa read between the measured lines as controlled professional interest. Her fee for representation through the initial court phase would be $120 in installments. First installment due upon engagement. She could be in Calderfield within a week of receiving confirmation. Elsa wrote back the same afternoon. Adeline Foss arrived on a Tuesday in late November, on the afternoon stage from Laramie. She was perhaps 45, with gray at her temples and the posture of a woman who had spent years standing in rooms where people expected her to sit down and had made a considered decision to remain standing. She carried a large leather case and shook Elsa's hand at the stage stop with a grip that simply had its confidence, rather than announcing it. They used Calloway's office because it was neutral ground, and because Calloway had offered it without being asked, which was its own kind of signal about where he stood. Foss spread her documents on the desk, and Elsa spread hers, and for 2 hours they went through everything. Foss asked questions that were surgical, always aimed at the one thing Elsa hadn't specified. At the end, Foss closed her notebook. The chain of title is sound. The Cheyenne firm knows this. Their contestation is a delay tactic. A pause. The estate property question is more interesting. The letter in the tin box is testamentary adjacent. Under abandonment doctrine, combined with a 20-year absence and the explicit language directing the finder to use the contents, a court could find intentional transfer. Another pause. The water rights claim is the strongest element. Prior appropriation is settled law here. Your upstream position is unambiguous. She looked at Elsa across the desk. The 1882 survey interference, if Calhoun testified, introduces a dimension the Cheyenne firm has not fully accounted for. That touches federal jurisdiction. It touches the railroad company itself. Calloway said from his chair at the side, Calhoun will put it in writing. He already told Stoll he would. He said he's been waiting for someone to ask. A silence settled in the room, the particular silence of three separate things revealing themselves as one connected thing. Voss picked up her pen. I'll file a formal response to the contestation within the week. I'll petition the territorial court for declaratory judgment on the water rights question. And I'll contact Calhoun directly. She paused. Expect this to take months, not weeks. Men with resources make time work for them. Our job is to make time work against him instead. The weeks that followed had a strange quality. Everything important was happening in offices and courtrooms and letters traveling by stage between cities, while the days at Dry Fork continued with their own unhurried urgency. Winter settled over the basin properly now, the snow deep on the north ridge, the creek running slow and dark between its ice-edged banks. She cut more wood than she thought she'd need and stacked it against the east wall of the cabin. She was right to cut more. Wyoming winter had opinions about what was enough. Calloway rode out every Tuesday. He was not a man who filled silence unnecessarily, which meant their conversations were efficient and, over time, genuinely comfortable. He told her on his third visit that the mayor had quietly declined to include Rupert's Eastern Valley proposal on the December meeting agenda. On his fourth visit, he mentioned that Odom had been seen having a long lunch with Voss in Calderfield. On his fifth, that Rupert had made inquiries about land values in the eastern counties. Not buying, just asking. The kind of asking that a man does when he is beginning to think about what happens next if the current situation does not resolve the way he planned. She absorbed this without letting it become certainty. Men like Rupert did not concede. They recalibrated. An inquiry about other counties was the earliest edge of a retreat being considered, not a retreat already in progress. The territorial court's preliminary response to Voss's petition came in January. Its language was favorable enough that Voss described it in her next letter as an encouraging preliminary indication, which in lawyer language meant something closer to significant progress than the neutral phrase suggested. Then February brought the thing she had not anticipated. A letter arrived postmarked from a small town in Colorado she had never heard of. Plain paper, no law firm, no official heading. The handwriting was old, uneven, each letter slightly enlarged, the way handwriting gets when the hand that makes it is used to effort now rather than ease. She stood at the well to read it because that was where she happened to be when the rider brought it, and the cold air off the stone was sharp against her face. My name is Josiah Marsh. I understand someone has been looking into my claim. She read it 3 times without moving. Josiah Marsh was alive, 71 years old. He had spent the years after leaving Wyoming in New Mexico and then Kansas and briefly Nebraska, working at various things, never settling, never returning. He had heard about what was happening at Dry Fork, through what he described only as a mutual acquaintance in Calderfield, which she believed was Silas Oakes, who had apparently taken his decision to do the right thing seriously enough to find the man he'd failed in 1871 and tell him what was unfolding on his old land. Marsh wrote that he had no wish to reclaim the property. He understood that it had passed through the county for taxes and been properly transferred, and he had no quarrel with that process. What he had wanted for 19 years was for the record to show what Edmund Voss had done. He had not been in a position to make that happen from Colorado. He understood that someone was now in a position to make it happen from Dry Fork. He had enclosed a document. It was a notarized statement, signed and witnessed before a notary in the Colorado town, in which Josiah Marsh described in his own words the meeting with Edmund Voss in October of 1871, the papers he had signed, what he had been told they said versus what they actually said. He attested that he had received no compensation for any water rights, that no partnership had ever been formed, that Edmund Voss had used the signed documents to establish a claim on the Eastern Valley's water access that belonged, under the original upstream deed, to the Marsh parcel. And at the bottom, in a paragraph set apart from the rest, Marsh had written something else. He wrote that prior to leaving, in the winter of 1871, he had placed certain personal property in the well on the Dry Fork parcel with the specific intention that it pass to whoever next occupied the land and put it to beneficial use. He affirmed that this transfer had been his intention since the day he left. He had not known who would come. He had trusted that someone would. He wished the finder well. She stood at the well with the letter and the statement in both hands, and the cold was doing something to her face that she did not try to stop. Not grief. Not exactly. Something older and harder to name, the feeling of understanding, fully and finally, what something had cost someone you would never meet. He had built this well. He had chosen every stone for how it would sit against the next one. He had found the water below and understood what it meant and written it down and hidden it, and walked away and carried all of it for 19 years in Colorado and Kansas and Nebraska, waiting not for rescue but for record. Just for the record. Just for someone to know. She sent the statement to Voss by the fastest available route, with a note explaining what it was. Voss's reply came back in 4 days. Half a page. It said, "This resolves the estate property question entirely. It also materially supports the water rights argument by establishing that Marsh understood and documented the upstream nature of the claim before Edmund Voss interfered. Calhoun's written affidavit has also now arrived. We have a complete record. I will be in contact with Odom directly." She read Voss's letter at the table in the cabin. The stove was going. Snow was coming down outside the canvas window, the soft, purposeful snow of a February storm settling in for the day. The fire made the only sound in the room. She set Voss's letter down beside Marsh's letter and looked at the two of them side by side on the table and thought about all the years between them, all the distance and silence that had separated what Marsh had known from anyone who could use it. He had trusted the ground to hold it. The ground had held. She picked up her father's will from the satchel, the copy Oakes had given her in his office in November, and read it again. Not for the legal content which she had memorized by now. For the handwriting. Thomas Hale had pressed hard into the paper when he wrote, the same quality as Voss's handwriting, the quality of a person accustomed to writing things that needed to hold weight. Her father had written this will 3 weeks before the fever took him, which meant he had written it, knowing something might happen, knowing Rupert's character the way you know a weather pattern, by what it does to the landscape. He had not told her. He had been protecting her from worry, or had not wanted to frighten her, or had believed it would never be needed. Or perhaps he had simply done what careful people do, prepared for the thing he hoped would never happen and then got on with living. And what he had done in preparing was to put his daughter's name on a piece of paper and give it to a stranger to keep. Silas Oakes had been that stranger, had kept it 22 years in a county land office in Calderfield, had opened his drawer one afternoon in November and handed it to Elsa across his desk, with trembling hands and the expression of a man setting down something he had been carrying long enough that the weight had become part of how he stood. Her father had trusted a near stranger to keep his daughter safe, and the near stranger had held that trust for 22 years, imperfectly, with guilt, but had held it. And Josiah Marsh had trusted the stone of the well he'd built with his own hands, and the stone had held. And Edmund Holt had trusted her with a hammer, and the trust had held. She sat with all of that for a while. The fire made its small sound. The snow came down outside. There was a particular kind of courage, she thought, that no one ever put a name to. Not the courage of standing up in public or confronting an enemy or walking 14 miles on worn boots. The courage of preparation. The courage of doing the careful, unglamorous work of getting ready for something terrible you hoped would not come, and then trusting someone else to carry it forward if it did. Her father had that courage. Marsh had it. Oakes, late and imperfectly, had found it. She had been the beneficiary of 3 men's careful preparation. She wanted to be worthy of that. Not in the grand way, not in the way of speeches and monuments, in the practical way. In the way of doing the work right and doing it now, and trusting that it would matter to someone later, even if she would never know who. She put the will back in the satchel and went outside to check on the goats in the snow. Voss met with Odom in Laramie in late February. She wrote to Elsa about it in the detached professional tone she used for significant developments. The meeting had gone, in Voss's language, productively. Rupert Voss had received, through Odom, the complete documentation, Stoll's assessment, Marsh's letter and journal and map, and Colorado's statement, Oakes's testimony, Thomas Hale's will, and Calhoun's affidavit regarding the 1,882 survey interference. The last item was the one that changed the tenor of the conversation. A water rights dispute was a civil matter a man of Rupert's resources could manage for years. Documented interference with a federal railroad survey was something with a different name and different jurisdiction, touching the railroad company itself, which had its own lawyers and its own interest in having been deceived during an assessment it had paid for. Odom had asked for 3 weeks. Voss had given him 2. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of everything that had come before, because the shape of the outcome was visible but not its resolution, and all she could do was work and wait. She was better at both than she had been 8 months ago. Not because the waiting had gotten easier, it hadn't, but because she had learned that work was not a distraction from waiting. Work was the thing that made waiting bearable, because it gave her evidence daily that she was not standing still. She wrote a letter to Josiah Marsh in Colorado. It took 3 evenings to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she kept saying too much and then taking it out, trying to find the right amount, the honest amount, the amount that matched what he had done for her, without overstating what she had done with it. She told him the legal situation and where it stood. She described what his statement had made possible. She told him the well was producing good water through the freeze, the stone circle as sound as the day it was built, and that she had put her hands on it many times in the months she'd been here, and thought about the man who had chosen each stone. She did not tell him to come back. She understood by now the difference between people who make things and people who maintain them, and she understood that he had made his peace with leaving, and that asking him to unmake it would be the wrong use of what he'd given her. At the end of the letter she wrote, "Your compass is on my shelf. It still points north. It has always pointed north. I think it did even in the dark at the bottom of the well, even in all those years before I found it. Some things know their direction regardless of whether anyone is watching." She sent it and did not expect a quick reply. He was 71 and in Colorado, and had already done the largest thing she would ever ask of him. The answer from Odom came on a Friday morning in early March. Voss brought it herself, riding out to Dry Fork with Calloway, and Elsa saw them coming down from the south road while she was clearing debris from the east side of the property. She walked to meet them at the edge of the basin and read the expression on Voss's face before Voss said a word. Not triumphant. Settled. The expression of a professional who has achieved what she said she would achieve and is now delivering the result with the same measured quality she had brought to every other step. They went inside. The 3 of them at the rough table, the stove going, March light coming cold and white through the canvas window. Rupert Voss had signed. Voss laid the agreement on the table and walked her through it without ceremony, because ceremony was not Voss's way. First, the withdrawal of all legal challenges to the Dry Fork deed and title, with prejudice meaning they could not be refiled. Second, the formal acknowledgement, recorded with the county, that the upstream water rights of the Dry Fork parcel were senior to any downstream claim by the Voss Eastern Valley holdings under prior appropriation doctrine. Third, the payment to Elsa Hale of $4,200, representing the assessed value of the Hale mercantile at the time of its sale, on the basis of a probate court review of Thomas Hale's will that Rupert had agreed not to contest. Elsa looked at the number. $4,200. Not because Rupert had become a just man, because Odom had done the arithmetic on what fighting cost versus what settling cost, and settling had come out cheaper, and men like Rupert ultimately trusted arithmetic more than they trusted anything else. She understood that. She did not need it to be more than it was. But she thought, sitting at that table with the agreement in front of her, about the $9 in the thin envelope, about the list of expenses he had prepared so neatly, so completely, the administrative finality of it. She thought about the mercantile her father had built and the sign her mother had painted, and the years she had worked there without a wage, while Rupert categorized her as a cost to be managed. $4,200 was not justice in the deep sense. It was correction. It was the arithmetic being set right on paper, which was not the same as the wound being healed, but was real, and was something, and was what she had asked for. She signed. Calloway witnessed it. Voss collected her copy. And then there was a moment of quiet in the cabin, the 3 of them at the table with the completed document between them, and the morning light moving slowly across the floor planks that Elsa had laid with her own hands the previous fall. Voss broke it first, practical as always. My remaining fee of $60 comes from this. The balance of $4,140 is yours. Calloway looked at the floor planks for a long moment. Then he looked up and gave the small nod he had been giving her since the first time he rode out to Dry Fork and found her standing at the well. It meant the same thing it had always meant. It meant, "I see what you've done here." He did not say it because he did not need to. After they left, she sat alone at the table. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. What she felt was quieter than relief and harder to name. Something like the feeling of a joint fitting cleanly into place. The sound it makes when you've cut it right, and the two pieces come together without force and without gap. Just the wood meeting itself the way it was always going to. It was the feeling of a thing being finished that had needed finishing for a long time. She thought about her father. Thomas Hale had built the Mercantile from nothing, had laid its floors and painted its sign and kept its accounts and loved his daughter with the steady, uncomplicated warmth of a man who did not need to announce what he valued because he showed it every day in the work. He had seen Rupert's nature clearly enough to write a will and give it to a stranger. He had done all of that and then died. Before he could know whether it would hold, before he could know whether the careful thing he'd done would reach the person it was meant for. It had reached her. 22 years late, through a county land office and a guilty old man who had finally decided to stop being afraid, but it had reached her. Her father had prepared for her future without being able to see it, and his preparation had mattered, and he would never know that it had. She pressed her hand flat on the table. The wood was solid under her palm. She had built this table from leftover planks in the second week, rough and functional, the same wood she'd walked 14 miles to buy in Calderfield. It was not beautiful. It was exactly level, and it would hold anything she put on it, and it would last longer than she would. Some things you build for people you will never meet. Her father had understood that. Josiah Marsh had understood it. Edmund Holt, pressing a hammer into her hands 2 days before he died, had understood it most simply of all. You give what you have to who is in front of you, and you trust the giving forward, and if you have done it right then what you gave will keep going long after you cannot. She was going to keep going. She stood up, put on her coat and walked out to check on the goats. March in Wyoming was not spring. It was winter, pretending to consider the possibility of spring, the snow still deep on the north ridge but the south-facing slopes beginning to show the gray-brown of bare ground in the afternoon. The goats were opinionated about the mud but tolerating it. She fed them and checked the pen and stood in the cold for a moment looking east. Past the east ridge, in the valley beyond, Rupert Voss was doing whatever he did on a March morning in the house she imagined was warm and managed by people he paid. He was not ruined. She had not ruined him. She had stopped him from taking what was not his, which was a different and more precise thing, and it had required a different and more precise kind of effort than ruin would have. She felt no need to go further than what was necessary. What was necessary was done. She turned back to the basin. Spring came the way Wyoming springs come, reluctantly and then with sudden conviction, as if the land had finally decided to stop negotiating and commit. The snow retreated from the slopes and the creek ran loud and full, and the sage went from silver to green in the space of 2 weeks. She broke ground on the east clearing in April, turning the dark soil near the base of the ridge, and the earth opened under the spade with a richness that surprised her every time. As if the land had been saving this for someone patient enough to wait for it. Stoll came in April with 2 men from his survey team and they sank a proper bore casing at the location of Marsh's 4th test hole. At 11 feet they hit the water vein. The water came up cold and clean and moving, not pooled but running. The same water that had been flowing under this ground since before any of them were alive. Stoll stood at the bore and looked at it with the expression of a man who has confirmed something he knew, and is feeling the weight of having it be real rather than theoretical. She paid him his assessment fee from the settlement and he took it without false modesty and rode back to Harwick. Dorothea came to the east clearing on a Wednesday in May, and they worked together as they had, through the winter, the comfortable near silence of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms. The water-sharing agreement had been Elsa's idea, not Foss's. Foss had raised the risks, which was her job, and Elsa had listened and then said she understood the risks and wanted to do it anyway, and Foss had drafted it without further argument because Foss was a professional who respected a client who knew her own mind. Dorothea's cattle would have access to the distribution channel from June. In return, she worked 2 days a week at the clearing through the growing season. It was not charity on either side. It was 2 people with adjacent land and adjacent interests making a sensible arrangement, which was what communities actually ran on. Not on grand gestures, but on sensible arrangements made between people who trusted each other enough to show up. Arlo Pruitt built the channel's wood-framed sections at his mill. He delivered them himself, 3 times his usual delivery distance, and when she tried to pay extra for the travel, he became briefly irritated. In the particular way he became irritated when people misread his intentions. She stopped trying to pay extra and said, "Thank you," instead, and he grunted and unloaded the lumber and went home. She thought sometimes, in those weeks of building, about the sequence that had produced what Dry Fork was becoming. 60 acres of rocky ground that nobody wanted, a well that everybody thought was dry, a tin box in the dark that had been waiting 18 years for someone to clear what was blocking it, and below all of it the water, always there, always moving, patient in the way that only things without consciousness can be patient, with no awareness of waiting at all. She wrote one more letter to Josiah Marsh in June, a shorter one this time. She told him the bore was sunk and producing. She told him the east clearing was planted with wheat and kinch vegetables, and that the water was reaching it through the channel, and that the soil was responding the way soil responds when it gets what it has been lacking, with a speed that looked almost impatient. She told him she hoped Colorado was good to him. She told him the well he had built was still the finest piece of stonework on the property, and that she did not expect to improve on it. She did not know if he would write back. She thought perhaps he would not need to. Some things are finished when the right person is told they are finished, and she believed she had told him. It was an August afternoon, late, the light going gold and horizontal across the basin, when she heard the footsteps on the south road. Not a horse. Footsteps. She was at the east clearing doing the last of the day's irrigation work, and she straightened up and looked toward the road. A young woman, 20 perhaps, dark-haired, with the reddened cheeks of someone who had been walking for a long time in summer heat, a canvas bag over one shoulder. Boots worn at the outside edge of the heel in the way that boots wear when a person walks distances regularly and on the same ground. She had arrived at the edge of the basin and stopped, looking at the cabin and the well and the channel and the cleared field, taking it all in with an expression that was not wonder exactly, but was its close neighbor, the expression of someone who had expected to find one thing and found another. Elsa left the clearing and walked toward her. The young woman watched her come without retreating, which told Elsa something. People who are unsure of their welcome tend to shift their weight back when a stranger approaches. This one held her ground, not with aggression, but with the natural stillness of someone who has learned that holding ground is not the same as being unwilling to move. Her name was Willa. She had been working for a family in Calderfield as a house girl, cooking and cleaning and doing the work that houses require. And 3 weeks ago the family had accused her of theft in order to avoid paying the back wages they owed her, which was a calculation that people in that position made, because the law made it easy for them to make it. She had nowhere to go. She had $7 and a canvas bag, and someone on the road had mentioned, without specifying who or what exactly, that there was a woman at Dry Fork who might have use for help. Elsa listened to all of it. She had heard stories like Willa's before, had lived a version of one herself. She knew the particular arithmetic of it, how a person gets reduced to a liability in someone else's ledger and then settled out at below cost, and how the settling feels like being erased. She knew that what a person needed in the immediate aftermath of that kind of erasure was not sympathy. It was ground, somewhere specific to stand. "I don't have a room," Elsa said. "The lean-to is weather tight and has a cot. Come spring we can build something proper." She paused. "I can't pay wages yet. What I can offer is work that's real and a share in what the land produces, and someone who will tell you the truth about what you're doing." Willa's chin came up slightly, not in defiance, in attention. "What would I be doing? Tomorrow, clearing the south edge of the east field. After that, learning to read soil and manage water and keep the channel clear and understand what the work is actually for." Elsa looked at her steadily. "Everything I know about this land I learned from people who taught me without being asked to. I intend to do the same." A pause. "I don't know anything about any of it." "I know." Elsa turned toward the cabin. "Come on, there's food and you can sleep tonight." They ate what there was, bread and cheese and cold water from the well, and Willa ate with the focused speed of someone running a deficit. After, she looked around the cabin at the tight-laid floor, and the square-hung door, and the chinked walls, the accumulated evidence of a year's careful work visible in every surface. "You did all this alone." "Most of it. Some with help." Elsa added, "The help was earned. Both directions." Willa was quiet a moment. "Then, the people in Calderfield, some of them said you fought Rupert Voss." Elsa considered how to say the accurate thing. "I didn't fight him. I made what was true visible to enough people that fighting became more expensive for him than stopping. Another silence. Willa turned this over, examining it. Is that harder than fighting? It's slower, Elsa said. Slower and lonelier, and you don't always know until it's done whether it worked. She looked at the stove. But it lasts longer, and you don't have to become something else to do it. Willa went to the lean-to, and Elsa banked the fire and sat on the step outside in the warm August dark. The stars were out in full, the summer sky dense with them. The east clearing was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the basin floor, and through it she could hear the channel running, the small, continuous sound of water moving in the direction it was always going to move, following the grade she and Pruitt had built for it, finding its way by the simple and irresistible fact of being water on a slope. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the compass. She had thought, when Rupert signed the agreement, that the compass would feel different afterward, that it would feel finished, discharged, a thing that had done its work and could be set aside. It did not feel that way. It felt the same as it always had, the same weight, the same warmth from her hand, the needle swinging and settling with the same unhurried certainty. For the one who stays. Marsh had scratched those words before he left. Before he knew he was leaving for good, he had scratched them in the brass, and put the compass in the dark, and walked away, and the words had waited there in the cold and the black for 18 years, waiting for the kind of person who would clear the blockage rather than walk past the dry well and decide it meant what everyone said it meant. She thought about what it was, exactly, to stay. It was not stubbornness. It was not having nowhere else to go. It was a choice made daily, in small ways, to put the next nail in the next board and trust that the board would matter, to write the next letter, and trust that it would reach the right person, to hand the next thing to the next person in the chain, and trust that the chain would hold. Her father had stayed in the mercantile, in the careful work of raising a daughter, and preparing for a future he feared he might not see. Marsh had stayed in his choice to document rather than simply disappear. Edmund Holt had stayed in the shop until his lungs gave out and had taught everything he knew to whoever was willing to learn it. Oakes had stayed, imperfectly, and with guilt but stayed, in the land office with the will in his drawer, waiting for the right question. She had stayed here, in this basin, at this well, against every reason to leave. In the lean-to behind her, Willa was breathing in the deep, even rhythm of genuine exhausted sleep. The sleep of someone who has found somewhere safe enough to let their body stop holding itself up. Elsa had slept like that herself, her first night here, on the dirt floor of the cabin with the stove smoking and the roof open to the sky. She remembered what it had felt like to close her eyes in a place that was hers, and to feel, under all the uncertainty and exhaustion, the hard fact of ground. She would give Willa that. Not the compass yet. Not tonight. Tonight what Willa needed was sleep and food and to wake up in the morning to work that was real, and someone who would show her how to do it without making her feel small for not already knowing. That was what Edmund had given Elsa, and what she had been given without ever being asked to deserve it first. The compass would come later, when Willa had learned enough to understand what it meant, when she had stood at the well and put her hands on the stone and felt what it felt like to touch the work of someone who had not known her and had trusted her anyway, when she was ready to feel the weight of that. Some gifts are not ready to be received until the receiver has become who they need to be to hold them. Elsa closed her hand around the compass in her pocket. The basin was quiet. The channel ran its small sound through the clearing. The stars turned overhead on their ancient indifferent axis. The same stars that Josiah Marsh had watched from this ground 20 years ago. The same stars her father had looked at from the window of the mercantile in Redstone on nights he could not sleep. The same stars that would be here, doing exactly this, long after everyone who had ever touched this land was gone. She stayed out a while longer, not thinking, not planning. Just sitting in the August dark on the step of the cabin she had built, with her own hands on the ground she had claimed with her last $1.50, listening to the water move in the channel she had dug, and the goats shift in the pen she had repaired, and the quiet sound of a place that was finally alive in the way that Josiah Marsh had wanted it to be alive when he wrote those words in his letter 18 years ago, the words she had read by failing light on this same threshold. A home should not be silent. It should be filled with the sounds of work and living. She had done that. She was doing it. She would keep doing it. The compass was warm in her hand. The needle, she knew without looking, was pointing north. It always had been. She just had to get here to find out.